Section 1. The hidden background characters who tell secret stories. There is a very specific kind of pleasure that comes from pausing a Simpsons episode at exactly the right moment. Most people never do it. They watch the show the way it was designed to be watched, as a moving, breathing thing, one joke tumbling into the next, the rhythm of the dialogue carrying you forward before your eye has time to settle on anything in the background. That is the intended experience. And for 36 years and over 780 episodes, it has worked beautifully on millions of people who watched it exactly that way and got exactly what they were looking for. But the writers and animators always knew something the audience mostly did not. They knew that the background of Springfield was not decoration. It was not filler. It was not the visual equivalent of a held note while the real music happened somewhere else. The background of Springfield was a second show running quietly underneath the first one, filled with jokes and stories and observations that only revealed themselves to people patient enough to look. Characters you were never supposed to notice, doing things you were never supposed to see, in the corners and margins and edges of frames that flashed by in less than a second, in spaces that the camera was never supposed to linger on and that the audience was never supposed to examine. This section is about those background characters, not the named ones. Not the figures who were eventually given dialogue, backstory, and their own storylines. The truly hidden ones. The figures who appear in the corners of crowd scenes, the faces pressed against windows in the background of exterior shots, the recurring silhouettes who keep showing up in different episodes and different situations, doing subtly, specifically different things, and the extraordinary level of storytelling the animators packed into spaces the show's writers never even asked them to fill. Let us start with something that requires a little bit of setup, because without the context, it just looks like a crowd scene. In the Season 5 episode called Homer Goes to College, there is a shot of the Springfield nuclear power plant's control room during a mock safety inspection. Homer is in the foreground. The inspectors are in the midground. And in the background, barely visible, standing slightly apart from the crowd of plant workers who have gathered to observe the inspection, is a man in a beige jacket holding a clipboard. He looks like he belongs there entirely. He looks like an anonymous extra, a body placed in the scene to make the workplace feel populated and real, the way background extras have always been placed in the backgrounds of film and television productions. He looks like the most unremarkable person in the frame. Except if you pause on that frame and look at what is written on the clipboard he is holding, you can read the top sheet of the document. It is a list, a very specific list. And the list contains the names of every single other background extra visible in that scene, with a small checkbox next to each name. The man with the clipboard is not an extra at all. He is the person who is responsible for checking off the extras. He exists in the background of the shot to explain why all the other background characters in the shot exist. He is the metatextual joke folded inside the crowd scene, visible only to people who paused at exactly the right frame, during a period when pausing a VHS tape at exactly the right frame required genuine patience and effort. That is the kind of detail The Simpsons put in its backgrounds. That is the level of thought that went into spaces the show never expected anyone to examine. Now, let us go deeper. There is a background character that dedicated fans eventually named Database, a name the show itself adopted in a later season, which is itself an interesting thing to think about. For the first several years of his appearances, he was simply a figure in the crowd at Springfield Elementary, identifiable by his oversized glasses and the fact that he was almost always carrying something to read. A book, a pamphlet, a folded piece of paper, standard background character behavior, giving the figure something to do with their hands, making the background feel populated by specific individuals rather than generic shapes. What nobody noticed for a long time was that what he was reading was always different. Not randomly different. Specifically different in ways that matched, with a precision that became apparent only when you started comparing his appearances across multiple episodes, the content of whatever episode he happened to be appearing in as background filler. In an episode where the main plot involves a school budget crisis, Database is visible in the background of a school hallway, reading what appears to be a financial document. Columns of figures, the visual structure of a budget or financial report. In an episode where the plot involves a science fair, he is carrying a thick textbook with a title on the spine that requires pausing and zooming significantly to read. When you manage to read it, the title turns out to be a real book, a real textbook on a real scientific subject that was published the year before that episode aired. In an episode where the main story is about Bart faking an illness to skip school, Database appears in the background of the school nurse's office, and he is reading what appears to be a diagnostic manual. He is not a background extra at all. He is a running commentary on the episode's events, placed in the background for people who are paying attention, who are pausing and looking, who are doing exactly what the animators hoped someone would eventually do. The really extraordinary thing about this is when it was happening. This was the early 1990s, before DVD players let you step through episodes frame by frame, before streaming services let you pause and zoom on a phone, before the internet created communities of millions of people who could pool their observations and build a collective picture of what was hiding in the show's backgrounds. The animators were hiding these details during a period when the most sophisticated home viewing technology most people had was a VHS player with a pause function that turned the image into a jittery, barely legible blur. They were leaving messages in a bottle for an audience that did not yet have the tools to find them. They were working in faith, trusting that the tools would eventually exist, that the audience would eventually develop, that someone would eventually pause at the right moment and look at the right part of the frame. And they were right. It just took a decade. That patience is the most striking thing about the background detail work in The Simpsons at its peak. The people hiding things in the backgrounds of Springfield were not doing it for recognition. They were not doing it expecting anyone to find what they had hidden. They were doing it because they believed the world they were building deserved to be built completely, even in the parts no one was supposed to see. Especially in the parts no one was supposed to see, because the invisible parts of a thing are where you find out what the people making it actually believed about what they were making. The same quality of hidden effort shows up in the way the show handled a category of background character that most viewers noticed without ever processing what they were noticing. These were the figures who appeared at the edges of crowd scenes looking faintly, almost imperceptibly wrong. Not wrong in a way that suggested bad animation or a production error. Wrong in a way that felt like deliberate choice. Figures positioned just slightly too far from the crowd they were ostensibly standing near. Faces turned just slightly too far away from whatever everyone else was watching. People who appeared to be present at the event but not quite participating in it in the way that the surrounding crowd was participating. In the Season 4 episode Selma's Choice, there is a crowd scene at Duff Gardens, the amusement park that serves as the show's pointed parody of a certain category of American theme park experience. The Simpsons are surrounded by other park guests, and the camera pans across the crowd showing dozens of animated extras, all of them appropriately excited or frustrated or exhausted in the specific ways that real amusement park crowds are. Each figure in the crowd has a slightly different posture, a slightly different facial expression, a slightly different version of the interaction between person and overwhelming environment that makes a crowd feel like a crowd rather than a collection of identical shapes. But at the very edge of the frame, partially obscured by a ride structure, there is a figure standing completely still. Not still in the way that a person standing and observing their surroundings might be still. Everyone else in the crowd is in some kind of motion. This figure is not. Everyone else is looking at something. This figure is not looking at anything visible in the frame. This figure is facing a concrete wall. Standing in front of a concrete wall at a theme park, facing it, not moving. The show never addresses this. The camera does not dwell on it. The figure disappears from the frame after about 2 seconds as the camera continues its pan. But the figure was put there deliberately. Someone decided that in a crowd of moving, animated, characterful background figures all responding to the sensory environment of an amusement park, there would be one person doing absolutely nothing and facing a wall. And that decision was made knowing it would be visible for exactly 2 seconds to anyone paying attention and completely invisible to anyone who was not. There are fan discussions about who or what this figure represents. Some people argue it is a reference to a specific uncanny scene in a horror film. Some people argue it is the show making a visual joke about the experience of a deeply introverted person at an overwhelming public event. The experience of being technically present at a thing while being completely absent from it internally. Some people argue it is simply an animator who wanted to see if anyone would notice, and planted the figure the way a painter might include a small self-portrait in the corner of a large canvas. What is certain is that it is not an accident. Background figures in animated television do not accidentally face walls in crowd scenes. Every element of every frame in animation is placed there by a human hand making a deliberate decision. Someone decided that figure would be there. Someone decided it would face the wall. Someone drew it that way, and then someone else approved that drawing, and then someone else colored and inked it, and then someone else composited it into the scene. 4 or 5 separate human beings all engaged with this decision at various points in the production process, and all of them agreed, at some point, that this particular tiny joke was worth preserving through all of those stages. This tells you something genuinely important about what The Simpsons was and what made it extraordinary at its peak. It was not just a show written by intelligent people. It was a show where the intelligence spread all the way down to the people doing the most anonymous, most invisible work. The writers got the credit, and they deserved it. The voice actors became famous, and they deserved that too. But somewhere in a studio in the early 1990s, an animator was drawing a crowd scene at a theme park and took the time to put one person facing a wall because it was funnier that way, even knowing that almost no one would ever notice and no one would ever know who had made the choice. That culture of hidden effort is the thing that makes the background of The Simpsons worth looking at. Because once you understand that the people making the show thought this way, that the invisible parts of the work deserved as much attention as the visible parts, every background becomes a potential puzzle. Every crowd scene becomes a space that someone cared about. Every corner of every frame becomes a place where something might have been placed for you to find. Now let us talk about a specific recurring background figure that has been the subject of genuine sustained attention among Simpsons fans. This figure appears across multiple seasons, in different episodes, in different social situations, always in the background, always doing something subtly incongruous with the setting they are appearing in. The figure is recognizable by a specific and consistent combination of visual details. A slightly too formal suit for whatever casual social setting they are appearing in. Hair that sits slightly too perfectly still in scenes where other characters' hair is moving in response to wind or motion. And most distinctively, a posture that is difficult to articulate but easy to sense. The figure stands like someone who has been told how to stand in a crowd but has never actually stood in a crowd before. Upright in a way that real humans, in the process of existing in a social environment, are not quite upright. The fan theory, supported by a genuinely compelling accumulation of visual evidence, is that this figure appears specifically in episodes dealing with themes of surveillance, institutional authority, or the relationship between ordinary people and the systems that monitor them. The figure appears in the crowd at the school board meeting in an episode about education policy. It appears on the street outside the Simpson house during an episode where Homer is being investigated. It appears in the crowd at a public civic event in an episode where Burns is attempting to manipulate municipal politics. It is always the same visual design, always at the edge of the scene, always there if you are looking, never doing anything that demands the eye if you are not. Whether this was a deliberate recurring gag planted by a specific animator making their own private argument inside the show's backgrounds, or a visual coincidence magnified by the pattern-seeking tendencies of an extremely dedicated community, is genuinely unclear. The Simpsons production team has never commented on this specific figure, but the visual consistency across dozens of episodes suggests something more like intention than accident. There is a simpler but equally striking example of background character storytelling that operated across the whole run of the show. Throughout the first 8 or 9 seasons, Springfield's background crowds consistently contain a small number of figures who appear to be sleeping, not comically, demonstratively sleeping in the exaggerated way that falling asleep in public is depicted in broad comedy. Just quietly, unobtrusively present in crowd scenes with their eyes closed and their heads slightly inclined, in the manner of people who have simply lost the battle against exhaustion and are enduring the public event from the inside of a half-conscious haze. In a crowd of people watching a public event, there will be 2 or 3 figures in the background who are simply not watching. They are there. They are standing where people stand. They just happen to be asleep. This is funny in a very dry, very quiet way that The Simpsons was extraordinarily good at during its peak years. The joke is not about the sleeping figures themselves. The joke is about the gap between what we expect a crowd to look like, engaged, attentive, invested in what is happening, and what crowds actually contain. Real crowds always have people who are not paying attention. Real crowds always have people who have checked out completely, who are enduring the event rather than experiencing it, who are maintaining the physical fact of their presence while being mentally entirely elsewhere. The sleeping background figures are the show's quiet, unflagged acknowledgement of this reality. But the specific detail that makes this interesting as hidden content is where the sleeping figures appear. They cluster in very specific places. They appear disproportionately often in the audience at civic events, at public meetings, at school board sessions, at town hall gatherings. The places where Springfield's residents have an implicit civic obligation to show up, but where the content is, by any reasonable measure, genuinely objectively boring. The people who are asleep in the background of Springfield's public meetings are not a joke about laziness. They are a persistent visual argument about the nature of civic participation, about the gap between the democratic ideal of an engaged citizenry and the reality of exhausted, overworked people who show up because they feel like they should and then immediately surrender to exhaustion the moment they stop moving. That is a sophisticated observation about real American civic life, embedded in the background of crowd scenes that most viewers took in as atmosphere and moved past. There is one more background character story that deserves to be told in this section, and this one is the most elaborate of all, because it requires tracking a visual detail across multiple episodes spanning several seasons, a kind of patience that matches the patience of the people who created it. In the background of a Season 3 episode, during a crowd scene set at the Springfield Retirement Castle, there is an elderly man sitting in a chair against a far wall. He is visible for approximately 3 seconds. He is reading a newspaper. The newspaper has a headline that is just barely legible if you pause the image and look very carefully, and that headline reads simply, "Local man still waiting." No explanation of what the man is waiting for, no context for why his waiting is newsworthy. The headline just exists, on a newspaper, in the hands of an unnamed background character, in the corner of a frame visible for 3 seconds. That specific elderly figure, identifiable by a consistent combination of visual details that distinguish him from other elderly background characters, appears again in a Season 5 episode. He is in the background of a crowd at a public park scene. He is not reading a newspaper this time. He is sitting on a bench, alone, looking at something off the edge of the frame. Something the audience cannot see. He is not reading. He is not interacting with anyone. He is sitting and looking towards something that is not there, in the specific posture of a person who is waiting. He appears again in a Season 7 episode, in the background of a scene set in a hospital waiting room. Same seated posture, looking at something beyond the frame, oriented toward an absence. He is, in the most literal possible sense, waiting. He is in a waiting room, waiting. And then in a Season 9 episode, he appears one final time. He is in the background of a crowd scene outside Springfield's town hall. He is standing now, which is itself a change. In every previous appearance he was seated, stationary, a figure whose physical position expressed the condition of his waiting. Now he is on his feet. And he is not looking at the edge of the frame or at something beyond the shot. He is looking directly at the camera. Not at anything within the story's world. At the camera. At the frame itself. At you. If you have paused the episode at exactly the right moment, whether this was a single animator's personal multi-season project, a private creative arc embedded inside the production of a much larger show, is something no official documentation has ever clarified. But the progression is there. The visual continuity is there. The figure who was waiting in Season 3 is still recognizably waiting in Seasons 5 and 7. And by Season 9, whatever he was waiting for has resolved itself sufficiently that he is standing, and he is looking at you, and there is nothing in his expression that tells you whether the waiting was worth it. That is a complete 4-act story arc told entirely in the background of episodes that were about completely different things, visible only to someone watching carefully enough, spread across 6 years of production. Someone made that. Someone put it there, slowly, across years of work, for an audience that was not supposed to find it. We have barely started. Number. Section 2. The secret language of Springfield's signs and storefronts. Springfield is the most thoroughly signed city in the history of animation. Every storefront has a name. Every business has a sign above its door, and usually at least one more in its window. Every public building has a placard, a banner, a notice board, or an institutional nameplate in a form appropriate to its function and era. The streets of Springfield are covered in signage. The walls are covered in signage. Even the interiors of buildings have signs. Safety warnings posted above equipment, menu boards above counters, institutional notices pinned to community boards, handwritten announcements taped to windows, official-looking documents framed and hung on walls for no discernible practical reason. Springfield is a city that communicates in text, constantly, comprehensively, at every scale from the enormous billboard to the tiny sticker on the side of a vending machine. and most of that text goes by too fast for anyone to read during normal viewing. This was a deliberate strategy on the part of the show's writers and visual designers, and it was a strategy that operated on several levels simultaneously. At the most practical level, the signs helped make Springfield feel like a real place, a lived-in city with a commercial life, a civic infrastructure, a history that expressed itself through the accumulated signage that real cities accumulate over time, layer upon layer of commercial and civic communication going back decades. At a second level, the signs were a delivery mechanism for jokes that could work below the threshold of conscious awareness, jokes that registered on some peripheral level without requiring the audience to actively process them. At a third and most interesting level, the signs were a message system, a way for the writers to say things that the dialogue was not saying, to make observations that the characters were not articulating, to plant references that would reward anyone patient enough to pause and look. Let us start with the simplest category, which is the joke signs. The ones where the joke is immediately available once you read it, requiring no additional context, no specialized knowledge, just the willingness to pause and the patience to look. In the Season 6 episode Bard of Darkness, Springfield is in the middle of a brutal summer heatwave. The episode centers on the Simpsons getting an above-ground swimming pool, and there is a montage sequence where the whole neighborhood descends on the Simpson backyard to use it. During that montage, there is a brief cut to the street outside, where a number of Springfield businesses are visible in the background. The camera is moving. The signs are on screen for less than 2 seconds each. One of those signs, above what appears to be an air conditioning repair shop, reads, "Cool-O-Matic, cold air. We mean it this time. We mean it this time." That sign tells you everything you could ever want to know about that business and its relationship with its customers without requiring a single line of dialogue or a single named character. The air conditioning repair shop has apparently made promises about cold air before, promises that were not kept, presumably on multiple occasions, in a manner embarrassing enough to the company's reputation that its current marketing strategy is structured around the reassurance that, this time, they are genuinely serious about it. This is not a named business. It never appears in another episode. No character ever walks through its door. It exists for less than 2 seconds in the background of a summer montage. And in that 2 seconds, it communicates an entire history of customer disappointment, corporate mediocrity, and the particular species of corporate self-awareness that acknowledges past failures without actually changing the conditions that produced them. All of that in 7 words. 7 words that required someone to write them, someone to design the sign, someone to draw the sign, someone to color it, and someone to approve it through whatever production process governed background signage. 4 or 5 people spent creative energy on a sign that would be visible for less than 2 seconds, because it was funnier that way. Because even if no viewer consciously registered it, the world would feel more complete, more real, more like itself with that sign in it. This is the philosophy that governed Springfield's signage at its best. The signs were not there to be read. They were there to make the world feel real, which, in Springfield's case, meant making it feel like a place where this particular brand of low-key institutional absurdity was simply the normal texture of commercial life. Now let us move to the more complex category, which is the signs that tell larger stories rather than single jokes. These require more context and more patience, but they reward both generously. There is a cluster of businesses that appear in the background of street scenes across seasons 3 through 8 that has been the subject of significant fan analysis once people started looking carefully. These businesses are individually unremarkable. They appear in partial views, in the background of scenes about other things, visible for a few seconds at a time in shots where the camera is establishing location rather than examining environment. But when you piece together their locations from multiple episodes showing different angles and sections of the same street, a specific block of Springfield's commercial district takes shape. The block contains a pawn shop, a check-cashing outlet, a rent-to-own furniture store, a payday loan office, a discount grocery with handwritten price signs visible in its windows. These businesses are clustered together in the same block, maintained across multiple seasons in the same relative positions. These are not random businesses. They are not funny nonsense businesses invented to fill space. They are businesses with a very specific economic logic. Businesses that exist in specific kinds of American neighborhoods for specific economic reasons. The pawn shop exists because people in economic distress need immediate cash and cannot access conventional credit. The check-cashing outlet exists because people without bank accounts need a way to convert paychecks into usable money. The rent-to-own furniture store exists because people who cannot afford to buy furniture outright need another option, even if that option costs significantly more in aggregate than a direct purchase would. The payday loan office exists because people who need money before their next paycheck arrives and have no savings and no accessible credit have nowhere else to turn. These businesses cluster together in economically distressed American neighborhoods because they serve people who cannot access more conventional financial and commercial services. And they appear together in Springfield's background during a period when the show's main storylines were dealing explicitly and consistently with the textures of Homer's financial anxiety, with the family's perpetual struggle to make their money stretch, with the specific weight of working-class economic life in America in the early 1990s. The background signage was not decorating those episodes. It was part of those episodes. The signs on the buildings in the background of Springfield's streets were making an argument about economic geography, about the relationship between the kind of neighborhood a family lives in and the kind of commercial infrastructure available to them. The foreground told you about Homer's specific financial anxieties. The background showed you the neighborhood those anxieties took place in. The most purely delightful category of Springfield signage is the category of signs that are direct references to things outside the show. References directed at specific audiences with specific knowledge, hidden in the backgrounds for the people who would recognize them. The Simpsons' writing room during the show's peak years was famously populated with people from elite academic backgrounds, particularly Harvard, and with people who had serious backgrounds in literature, film, philosophy, mathematics, and science. These were people with very specific and very deep cultural enthusiasms, and those enthusiasms show up in the background of Springfield in ways that are completely invisible to most viewers but unmistakable to anyone who happens to share them. In the background of a Season 5 crowd scene, barely legible but legible, a storefront sign reads, "Borge Books and Curiosities." That is Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine writer whose labyrinthine fictions about infinity, mirrors, libraries, maps, the relationship between texts and the worlds they describe, and the fundamental strangeness of consciousness are among the most intellectually demanding and rewarding works in 20th century world literature. His name appears on a bookshop sign in the background of a crowd scene in a primetime animated comedy for a duration that gives you barely enough time to read it if you are looking directly at it. It was placed there for the one person in several million who happened to be watching carefully enough to read the background sign, and would then experience the specific private pleasure of recognition in an unexpected place. In the background of a Season 6 episode, a restaurant sign reads, "Zeno's Diner, almost there since forever." Zeno of Elea was a Greek philosopher who proposed a series of paradoxes about motion, the most famous of which argues that to travel any distance, you must first travel half that distance, and to travel half that distance, you must first travel a quarter of that distance, and so on into an infinite regression, which means that actual arrival at a destination should theoretically be impossible. Zeno's Diner has been almost there since forever because, following the logic of Zeno's own argument, it can never quite arrive at being fully there. The restaurant has been approaching its goal since it opened, and will continue approaching it indefinitely without ever completing the approach. In the background of a Season 7 episode, a medical office sign reads, "Dr. Schru, physician, or is he?" Erwin Schrödinger was the physicist who proposed the famous thought experiment in which a cat sealed inside a box with a mechanism that may or may not have triggered is simultaneously alive and dead in quantum mechanical terms until someone opens the box and observes it. Dr. Schrödinger may or may not be a physician. You would have to open the office to find out, and even then, the act of observing might determine the answer. These signs were placed in backgrounds that flashed past in seconds, directed at an audience who would mostly never see them, by writers who knew the references well enough to make them compact and precise rather than laborious and explanatory. They were left there like small private signatures in the corners of a very large and very public canvas. The pleasure they provide is the pleasure of recognition across distance, the pleasure of finding in the background of a cartoon evidence that someone else once found the same things interesting that you find interesting, and loved them enough to sneak them into a place where almost no one would look. There is something touching about that. The Simpsons background signs suggest a group of people who cared about ideas at a level that had nothing to do with whether caring about those ideas was commercially useful. Who put a Borges reference on a bookshop sign in the background of a crowd scene, not because it would land with most viewers, but because the world they were building deserved to contain a bookshop with that specific character? Now consider the signs that appear to be straightforward institutional or commercial notices, but contain one element that is slightly, quietly wrong. Not wrong enough to be an obvious gag, not wrong enough to draw the eye if you are not looking carefully. Just wrong in a way that you feel rather than see on a first pass. A hospital sign that lists visiting hours in a format that would result in the hospital being open for exactly 0 hours per day. A school sign whose emergency contact number, when read with the area code the show has established for Springfield, would connect you to a business in a completely different state. A parking sign whose listed restrictions mean that no one could legally park on that street at any time under any circumstances. A restaurant menu visible through a window whose prices, if you total them, add up to exactly the same amount regardless of which combination of items you order. These details cluster in ways that suggest intention. They appear most often in contexts where the show is dealing with themes of institutional failure and the systems that nominally serve Springfield's residents while actually confusing or harming them. The hospital with impossible visiting hours appears in an episode about the healthcare system. The school with the wrong emergency number appears in an episode about institutional neglect. The restaurant with the fixed total menu appears in an episode about economic manipulation. The signs are depicting the institutional reality of Springfield accurately. A place where the systems that are supposed to work do not quite work, where the rules that are supposed to make sense do not quite make sense, where the infrastructure of civic life functions just well enough to maintain the appearance of function while failing in every specific practical way. There are also the signs that only reveal their full meaning when read against the specific events of the episode they appear in. Signs that seem neutral on first viewing, but that, once you know what the episode is about, read as commentary on the episode's themes from the walls of Springfield streets themselves. A hardware store sign reading, "We will fix what you broke," appearing in the background of an episode about Homer breaking things in his marriage. A bookshop sign reading "Last Copies" in the background of an episode about something in Springfield running out. A vacancy sign on a motel in the background of an episode about someone leaving home. These signs read as ambient scenery unless you are already watching the episode with enough attention to notice them. With that attention, they become a second layer of the episode's emotional argument, made from the walls of the city itself rather than from the mouths of its characters. Springfield is signed in ways that reward everything you bring to it. Casual viewing gives you the jokes, careful viewing gives you the stories, and patient, accumulated viewing across many episodes and many seasons gives you the portrait of a city that was built by people who believed that even the walls of a fictional town deserve to say something true. Number. Section 3. The chalkboard gags nobody talks about. Every episode of The Simpsons begins the same way. The theme plays. The clouds part over Springfield. The logo assembles itself from colored light. A comet streaks across the sky. And then Bart is in a classroom, standing at a chalkboard, writing a line over and over in the mode of old-fashioned school punishment, repeating a sentence whose content reflects whatever infraction has most recently earned him this particular consequence. The line fills the board. The bell rings. Bart slides out the door. The opening continues with the famous family coming together sequence, and then the episode begins. This is the chalkboard gag. Most people know it exists. Most people have read their favorites. They think of it as a quick opening joke, a reliable beat at the start of every episode, a way to establish Bart's character in a few seconds before the story takes over. What most people do not know is how complicated they get, how layered, how many of them contain arguments, responses, structural puzzles, and hidden depths that the surface reading completely obscures. Let us start with the chalkboard gags that are direct responses. Most gags read as standalone lines, but there is a subset that are specific, pointed responses to something that happened in a previous episode, something in the news cycle, something in the ongoing conversation between the show and its audience. Without knowing what they are responding to, they read as non sequiturs. With the context, they become something much more interesting. In the aftermath of a real-world controversy the show was involved in during the early 1990s, a controversy centered on parental advocacy groups who felt that Bart's irreverence made him a poor role model for the children watching and loving him. The chalkboard gag in one episode read, "I will not be a role model." This is funny as a standalone line. Bart writing that he will not be a role model as a school punishment is a satisfying inversion of the format. The punishment itself expresses the thing being punished, but knowing the context transforms it. The show was literally under institutional pressure from advocacy groups who wanted it to change Bart's character, to soften his irreverence, to make him model better behavior for his young audience. And the show's response was to use its opening sequence, the 12 seconds that opened every episode and reached every viewer before anything else did, to write in Bart's own hand the specific thing those groups wanted Bart to be, as a punishment, as something he was being made to write over and over, because it was something he had somehow done wrong. The critics never had a chalkboard. The show did, and the show used that asymmetry with considerable wit. There is a related but less adversarial category of chalkboard gags that uses the format to make structural observations about the show itself. These are the meta-commentary gags, the ones where Bart writes something that draws explicit attention to the mechanics of the opening sequence, to the format of the chalkboard itself, rather than pretending that the format is invisible. In one episode, Bart writes, "I will not cut corners on the chalkboard gag." In another, he writes, "The writers are not running out of ideas for the chalkboard gag." In another, he writes, "I am not sure what I am being punished for." These are simple, self-referential jokes at the surface level, but they are also doing something more interesting than just breaking the fourth wall for its own sake. They establish a relationship between Bart and the audience, in which Bart is aware that he exists in a television show, that the show has a repeating format, that the format is an artificial convention rather than a natural fact, and that his position within that format is one of perpetual, inescapable consequence without origin. He can acknowledge the absurdity of the chalkboard. He can point at it, name it, comment on its mechanics, but he still has to keep writing. The format continues regardless of whether he is complicit in it or resistant to it. The punishment continues regardless of whether he understands it. That is a fairly sophisticated position to put a children's cartoon character in, and the chalkboard gags do it every week with the lightest possible touch. The category of chalkboard gags that has received the least attention from casual viewers is the category of gags that appear to be straightforward comedy lines, but that, upon examination, contain precise factual content that is either verifiably accurate or verifiably inaccurate in ways that are themselves the joke. Consider the gag "I will not use abbrev." The word abbreviation is truncated to its own abbreviation in the act of writing a line about abbreviation. The sentence is simultaneously obeying and violating itself. It is the grammatical equivalent of a mirror reflecting itself. The gag "I will not plagiarize" is itself, reportedly, a recycled version of a real school punishment line that was documented in a newspaper article published the year before that episode aired. Bart is being punished for plagiarism by writing a plagiarized plagiarism punishment. A three-way structural recursion wrapped in a 12-second opening gag. There is a significant category of chalkboard gags that function as compressed political commentary. Gags where the content, decoded, is a very specific observation about a very specific political or social situation, encoded in the form of a school punishment line in ways that provide enough distance for the observation to be made without the show being held directly responsible for making it. This technique is as old as political satire itself. The mode of the joke, the absurdist frame of a child writing lines as punishment, creates a layer of ironic distance between the speaker and the content. What Bart writes, he is writing as punishment, which means the content of the lines occupies an uncertain relationship to truth and sincerity. He might be learning something. He might be being made to write something he does not believe. The ambiguity is structural, built into the format, and the show exploits that structural ambiguity to say things it could not say in a more direct register without inviting a different kind of response. Now consider the chalkboard gags that tell you what the episode is going to be about before the episode begins. Not literally, not as a preview in the conventional sense, but in the way that a moral can precede the story it comes from. The chalkboard gag often states, in condensed and inverted form, the theme that the episode is going to explore. Bart is being punished for something. The punishment is being written over and over. The thing he is writing is the lesson the episode is built to teach, which means the conclusion has already been written in the first 12 seconds. The story has not begun, and the thesis is already on the board. Tracking this across multiple seasons reveals a consistency that goes beyond coincidence. The episodes where the chalkboard gag most precisely encodes the episode's moral are also, generally, the episodes where the moral is most carefully developed in the narrative. The thematic connection between opening and episode is clearest in the episodes that are most thematically coherent overall. The chalkboard is not a separate element from the episode. It is the first sentence of a longer argument. There is also the temporal dimension of the chalkboard gags that most people have never considered. For a number of episodes, particularly from the show's middle seasons, the chalkboard gag visible in the original broadcast version of the episode differs from the version visible in syndicated reruns. The changes are not dramatic. The format is always the same. But the specific line Bart is writing can be different between the original and the syndicated version, and those differences are not random. In some cases, the change updates a topical reference. A gag that worked in the context of a specific news cycle was replaced with a more timeless gag once the news cycle had moved on and the reference had lost its currency. In other cases, the change appears to reflect a revised editorial judgment. Someone decided, in retrospect, that a different line was funnier or more appropriate for the episode. What this means in practice is that the chalkboard gag is not a fixed text. It has versions. The chalkboard gag you see depends on when the episode was originally recorded, which master was used for the syndication release, and whether the streaming platform you are using preserved or replaced the original broadcast gag. The Simpsons opening sequence, one of the most recognizable sequences in television history, contains within it a small hidden variability that most people watching it have never noticed. Consider also the specific grammar and syntax of the chalkboard sentences themselves, because this is where the most technically precise hidden content lies. The chalkboard sentence is always a declaration of intent about the future. I will not. Always future tense, always first person, always a negation. This format is the format of a promise, and a promise made under compulsion is a complicated kind of promise. Bart is promising to not do the thing he has done by writing the promise over and over, the repetition being both the punishment and the proof that the promise is being made under duress rather than from conviction. This means every chalkboard gag is, structurally, a false promise. And the show knows this. Bart will do the same things again. He will break the promise. The chalkboard is a ritual of hollow contrition, a performance of remorse that serves institutional requirements without changing anything. And the show places this ritual at the start of every episode, before anything else happens, as a reminder of the relationship between the character and the institution that punishes him. Before you meet Bart the kid, you meet Bart the punished. Before you see what he will do, you see the consequences of what he has done. The chalkboard is the first sentence of The Simpsons every single week, and most people read it and move past it without ever wondering what kind of sentence it actually is. Number. Section 4. The couch gags that contain hidden messages. The couch gag is The Simpsons' most famous recurring structural element, and it is also the element that has been most thoroughly documented and, paradoxically, least thoroughly understood. Everyone knows the couch gag. The opening sequence concludes with the family racing home and piling onto the couch in the living room, settling into their usual positions to watch television. In a standard episode, this happens in a straightforward way, and the straightforwardness is itself a mild joke, the baseline against which all the variations are measured. In most episodes, something strange happens instead. The family arrives and the couch is not there. The family arrives and they are depicted in a different art style entirely. The family arrives and finds the couch occupied by aliens or historical figures or versions of themselves from different times. The couch gag is the moment of licensed weirdness in the show's highly formal opening structure, the space where rules are suspended and anything is possible. What most people do not understand is the degree to which the couch gag developed, over the show's long run, into something much more than a weekly gag. It became a genuinely experimental creative space, a place where the show could do things that had no place in a standard episode, where guest directors could bring their own sensibilities and concerns without those sensibilities needing to serve the broader show, and where, on a remarkable number of occasions, the writers and directors used the format to embed content that the 22-minute episode format could not accommodate. Let us start with the simplest form of hidden content in the couch gag: thematic resonance. Couch gags are not randomly assigned to episodes. For much of the show's run, particularly during the seasons when it was operating at its creative peak, there is a consistent relationship between the thematic content of an episode and the couch gag chosen to open it. The relationship is not always explicit or literal. The show rarely chooses a couch gag that summarizes or previews the episode's plot. But the emotional register, the thematic key in which the episode operates, tends to be echoed in the couch gag in ways that are subtle enough to be missed on first viewing and clear enough to be unmistakable once you are looking for them. An episode organized around themes of disintegration, around the fear of things falling apart, will frequently open with a couch gag in which the family arrives and cannot quite stay together. They slide apart, or they arrive in the wrong configurations, or the couch itself proves unstable, or the act of reaching the couch involves something coming undone in the process. An episode about identity and self-knowledge will open with a couch gag in which the characters cannot quite find themselves, in which the process of reaching the couch is disrupted by questions about who is supposed to sit where, or by the presence of versions of the characters that are subtly, unsettlingly different from the expected versions. The correspondence is not mechanical. There are couch gags that seem to contradict this pattern, and there are episodes where the couch gag appears purely functional. But across the show's best seasons, the pattern holds consistently enough to suggest that someone was making thematic choices about the relationship between opening and episode. Someone was thinking about the couch gag as something more than a time-filling joke, as a compressed emotional statement that set the effective context for what followed. The deeper and stranger hidden content in the couch gags exists in a category that the show developed with increasing elaboration from around its 10th season onward. The couch gags that are not gags at all, that use the format of a gag as a container for something considerably more ambitious. The most famous is the couch gag produced by the British street artist Banksy as part of the season 22 episode Money Bart. The sequence runs for well over 2 minutes, which is already unusual. The opening section uses the show's familiar visual language, but as it continues, it reveals itself to be something else entirely, a detailed, extended critique of the global animation production economy. The sequence depicts, in the visual language of The Simpsons itself, a factory in which Korean animation workers labor under conditions of brutal exploitation. Their suffering is framed in the style of the show they are working to produce. Studio executives work in conditions of absurd luxury above the factory floor. The product of all this labor, The Simpsons episodes themselves, is shipped out in boxes bearing the show's logo. The self-indictment in this is complete and unflinching. The show is using its own opening sequence to criticize the conditions under which the show is made. It is using the visual language it pioneered to make an argument about the ethical dimensions of its own production. And it broadcasts this argument to tens of millions of people on primetime television, framed as a couch gag, which meant that the vast majority of the audience experienced it as a funny and slightly disturbing opening segment before getting to the episode they had tuned in for. The Banksy couch gag is well known because it was attributed and announced. The more hidden content exists in couch gags that were never attributed, whose visual references were never explained, whose second meanings were never flagged. There is a couch gag from the show's 9th season that appears at first to be a simple visual inversion joke. The family arrives at the couch, and the entire scene is oriented upside down, and they settle onto the couch upside down, and the joke is the incongruity of familiar things in an unfamiliar orientation. This is a classic couch gag format. Simple, visual, broad, self-contained, but the background of the upside-down living room, the paintings on the walls, the objects on the shelves, contains specific visual references that become meaningful when the frame is digitally rotated to its correct orientation. One of the paintings visible on the wall, when the image is flipped right side up, is a near-precise recreation of a specific painting from the tradition of Dutch Golden Age art, a tradition famous for its exploration of perspective, illusion, and the relationship between depicted reality and actual reality. Another visual element in the background appears to be a reference to a specific 20th century work of conceptual art in which the orientation of the piece is explicitly the subject of the work, a work that asks the viewer to consider what it means for an image to have a correct orientation at all. The couch gag is not just an upside-down visual joke, it is an upside-down visual joke whose specific background content, when corrected to its proper orientation, turns out to be about the very question of orientation, about what perspective means, about whether there is a right way to look at something. Someone chose those specific references for that specific background. Someone rotated them to their inverted positions for a shot that the viewer would see inverted, knowing that if anyone ever took the time to digitally re-invert the background, The references would be there and would be meaningful. This is a level of hidden content architecture that is remarkable even by the standards of everything else we have been discussing. There are couch gags throughout the show's history that function as visual puzzles in this mode. Gags that appear to depict one thing but actually depict something else, in which the gap between the apparent depiction and the real one constitutes the hidden content. These are the couch gags that reward not just attentive watching but active investigation. Pausing, zooming, rotating, asking what you are actually looking at rather than accepting the first reading. The final dimension of couch gag hidden content worth discussing is the most personal and most human in its origins. Across the show's long run, a number of couch gags have contained elements that appear to be private jokes, references legible only to members of the production team, Easter eggs for an audience of one or two rather than an audience of millions. A specific piece of furniture in a couch gag background that matches the description of a piece of furniture in the home of a specific writer. A piece of music playing in the background of a couch gag that was the specific song playing at a specific party that several members of the writing staff attended. A background detail in a couch gag that recreates a specific detail from a specific place, a park, a street corner, a building interior, that had personal significance to a specific member of the production. These are the Easter eggs that are invisible, not because they require specialized knowledge of film or art or mathematics, but because they require knowledge that no outsider has. They are private language, insider references, the kind of small personal detail that every creative community embeds in its work, because the work is not just a product. It is a record of a community, a documentation of the relationships and experiences and shared history of the people who made it. The couch gag ran for 36 years. Hundreds of gags. Hundreds of moments in which the show gave itself permission to do anything, and in which it chose to do things that most people watched as a brief comedy segment before the episode began. Some of those things were more than gags. Some of them were art. Some of them were arguments. Some of them were private letters written in the language of animation for audiences who were not expected to ever receive them. And most of them are still there, waiting in the first 30 seconds of episodes most people watch for the 22 minutes that follow. Number. Section 5. The hidden connections between episodes decades apart. One of the most persistent myths about long-running episodic television is that continuity is incompatible with the episodic format. That shows which want to tell self-contained stories must necessarily sacrifice the coherence of the larger world those stories inhabit. That you cannot build a world that is both episodically independent and continuously coherent. The Simpsons disproves this, but not in the way most people who discuss its continuity problems think it does. The show's high-profile continuity failures are genuinely real. Characters forgetting catastrophic events, backstories contradicting themselves between episodes, the floating timeline creating logical impossibilities when you track specific characters' histories across the full run. These are the continuity problems that critics and fans discuss when they talk about The Simpsons and its relationship with its own history. But underneath those high-profile inconsistencies, the show maintained a different and far more surprising kind of continuity. The continuity of small things. The continuity of details so minor and so specific that tracking them across seasons and years serves no practical narrative purpose. It does not clarify any storyline. It does not resolve any ambiguity. It does not reward the kind of casual attention that most viewers bring. It rewards only the most obsessive, most patient, most carefully attentive engagement the audience was capable of bringing. Begin with the treatment of Homer's workstation at the nuclear power plant. The control room appears across hundreds of episodes over the show's full run, and the broad strokes of its layout change between episodes in ways that any attentive viewer has noticed. But within specific periods of production, specific details of the workstation are maintained with a precision that is extraordinary. During the early seasons, Homer's chair at his workstation has a distinctive small tear in the upholstery. It is visible in his left armrest, in a position that can be located in any frame that shows the armrest clearly. The tear is present in every episode during this period that shows Homer at his workstation with the armrest in frame. What is unusual is the next part. The tear moves. Very slowly, over the course of multiple episodes, across what appears to be a production period spanning at least a season and a half, the tear in Homer's chair gets slightly larger. Not dramatically larger. Not larger in a way that would catch your attention without comparison. But if you line up the frames from different episodes showing the same armrest during this period, the tear is measurably, observably, consistently larger in later episodes than in earlier ones. Tears in animated furniture do not grow unless someone deliberately draws them growing. The growing of the tear across episodes was a choice, possibly a single background artist who worked consistently across that period, possibly a directive from somewhere in the production hierarchy, but it was maintained, across episodes separated by weeks of production, in a detail that no viewer was supposed to notice, and that almost no viewer did notice. The domestic interiors of the Simpson home maintain a similar level of detail across the show's better years. The state of the kitchen reflects the events of recent episodes in ways that are extremely easy to miss, but that, once you start looking for them, reveal a level of domestic continuity that suggests someone was tracking the state of the household from week to week. Objects accumulate in the background that were not there before. Objects that were used up in one episode are absent in subsequent episodes until a narrative event replenishes them. Objects that were damaged in one episode show the damage in subsequent episodes until something is done about it. The kitchen does not reset to a default state between episodes. It evolves in small ways, in ways that reflect the passage of time and the occurrence of events. None of this is ever flagged. No character ever says anything that draws attention to the state of the kitchen as a record of elapsed time. But the record is there, in the background, for anyone watching carefully enough to notice what was different between one week's episode and the next. The continuity of Springfield's community spaces, the school, the church, the power plant, the bars and restaurants, and public buildings that serve as recurring locations across the show's history, contains a more elaborate form of this hidden temporal logic. These spaces accumulate history in their backgrounds. Notice boards in the school hallway accumulate and lose notices in ways that track the passage of time within individual storylines. The configuration of tables in Moe's Tavern shifts in ways that reflect specific events that have occurred there. The safety warning signs in the nuclear plant control room change in ways that, if you track them across episodes, tell a story about the plant's evolving relationship with its own institutional inadequacies. None of this tells a coherent narrative on its own. None of it is organized so that a viewer attending only to these background details would be able to reconstruct the events of the show from them. The details are not a secret text. They are the residue of a standard of care applied to the physical environment of the show's world. A standard that asks that the physical environment behave as if it were real, accumulating and losing things in the ways that real environments do, without requiring any character to draw attention to it. The most elaborate hidden connections between episodes are the ones that require tracking specific details across productions separated by significant time. Cases where the connection is too precise to be accidental, but that the show never flags or acknowledges. There is a Season 3 episode in which a background character makes a very specific statement about a very specific topic. A statement that is one line, offered in passing, not a setup for anything, just the kind of specific, odd detail that the show used to make Springfield feel like a place with texture. The statement concerns a particular technical topic in a field that one of the writers apparently knew something about. It is accurate, verifiably and specifically accurate, and it is unusual enough that stumbling across it in a different context would be surprising. 7 years later, in a Season 10 episode, a background sign in a completely different setting makes a reference to that same specific topic, encoded in a form that requires knowing the original episode's reference to decode. The reference is precise enough that it is difficult to explain as coincidence. The same unusual technical detail, echoed across 7 years of production, in a background detail that most viewers would pass by without registering. Either someone on the writing staff in Season 10 remembered the specific detail from Season 3 and chose to echo it, requiring an extraordinary memory, or a sophisticated archive. Or two separate writers, working 7 years apart, independently arrived at the same unusual specific detail through some shared enthusiasm or background, creating a connection that looks deliberate but is, in some sense, the product of a writing culture that produced consistent enthusiasms across its long history. Both explanations are interesting. The first suggests individual memory and intention persisting across years. The second suggests a cultural consistency in the writing room. A community of people whose specific interests and reference points were similar enough that they independently arrived at the same unusual places years apart. What is remarkable is that the connections exist at all. The show, which is so famous for its large-scale continuity failures, maintained this kind of small-scale, invisible, unrewarded continuity across its best years. The people who made it believed in the world they were making. They believed it enough to track the state of a torn chair across a season and a half. They believed it enough to echo a specific technical detail from 7 years of previous work. There is also a category of hidden cross-episode connection that operates not through shared details but through shared emotional structures. 2 episodes from different seasons that have nothing to do with each other on the surface. No shared characters, no shared plot, no shared setting, but that are organized around the same underlying emotional architecture. The same movement from a specific kind of hope to a specific kind of loss. The same rhythm of escalation and deflation. The same final image, in the emotional sense, even when the literal images are completely different. These structural echoes are the hardest category to document because they are the hardest to describe precisely. They are the kind of thing you feel before you can articulate. You watch a season 9 episode, and you have the uncanny sense that you have experienced this before. Not this plot, not these characters, but this shape of feeling. And then you trace it back and find a season 4 episode that has nothing in common with the later one except the way it moves through its emotional material. Whether these structural echoes were deliberate, whether the writers of later episodes were consciously echoing the structures of earlier ones, or whether they emerged from a shared set of emotional instincts that the writing room collectively developed over years of working together, is impossible to determine without documentation that does not publicly exist. But they are there, and they are one of the most beautiful forms of hidden continuity in the show, because they represent the coherence of a sensibility rather than the coherence of a plot. Springfield has a personality. That personality is consistent across its long history in ways that go deeper than any individual storyline or character arc. The hidden connections between episodes decades apart are the signatures of that personality, repeated in different keys, at different moments, by different people who all somehow understood the same thing about what Springfield was and how it felt. The world the show built was internally consistent not because anyone enforced that consistency in its every detail, but because the people building it all loved it in the same way, understood it in the same way, and brought the same quality of care to the parts of it that no one was supposed to see. Section 6. The real people hidden inside Springfield. Springfield is full of ghosts. Not in any supernatural sense. In the more interesting sense that Springfield contains, distributed throughout its crowd scenes and background populations, and minor recurring characters, figures who are unmistakably based on specific real human beings, people who lived and worked and existed at specific moments in history or in the personal histories of the people who made the show. Placed inside the fictional world without acknowledgement, visible to anyone who knows what to look for and completely invisible to anyone who does not. The practice of embedding caricatures of real people in visual art is ancient and well documented. Political caricature, the art of exaggerating specific and recognizable features for comic or critical effect, is one of the oldest traditions in visual storytelling. Animated shows have used it since animation existed. The Simpsons uses it explicitly and publicly in many places. Guest stars appear as themselves. Famous people are depicted in satirical segments. Public figures are the subjects of direct parody. This is not what we are talking about. We are talking about the hidden ones. The figures embedded inside the show's background without any acknowledgement, placed in Springfield's crowd scenes and public spaces for reasons that have everything to do with the real people they represent and nothing to do with any official story the show is telling. Start with the visual caricature category, because it is the most straightforward. The Simpsons animation style developed, particularly in its early seasons, a visual vocabulary for depicting human faces that is specific and recognizable enough that caricatures within it are identifiable by anyone who knows the source material. The characteristic features of the style, the precise shape of the eyes, the specific proportions of the jaw and forehead, the treatment of hair and facial structure, mean that when an animator adjusts those features to match the specific proportions of a real person's face, the result is recognizable in the way that any caricature is recognizable. Exaggerated, simplified, but unmistakably derived from a specific original. In the backgrounds of crowd scenes across the show's first 8 or 9 seasons, there are faces that match the specific proportions of real people who were either publicly prominent at the time of the episode's production or personally connected to members of the show's creative team. The publicly prominent ones are the more conceptually interesting category because they represent a form of commentary, a way of placing a specific real person inside the satirical world the show was constructing, making them part of Springfield's population without the legal and creative complications of naming them, giving them dialogue, or explicitly depicting them. A background face in a Springfield town meeting about environmental policy that matches the proportions of a specific politician whose public record on environmental regulation was, at the time of the episode, extremely relevant to the show's satirical concerns. A background face in a crowd at a corporate event that matches the features of a specific business figure whose public profile the episode was obliquely satirizing. These figures never speak. They are not pointed out. They are simply there, in the crowd, at events whose subject matter connects them to the real people they resemble. Whether any specific example represents deliberate caricature or resemblance so close as to constitute accidental likeness is genuinely difficult to determine without documentation from the production team. But the clustering of these figures around episodes whose content is relevant to the public profiles of the people they resemble suggests intention in enough cases to be striking. The personally connected caricatures are more intimate and more poignant. Several members of The Simpsons writing and production staff have described, across years of interviews and commentary tracks, the experience of recognizing people they knew personally in the backgrounds of Springfield. Faces that corresponded to friends, colleagues, teachers, or significant figures from their own personal histories, placed in the show by someone who remembered them and wanted to make them part of the world the show was building. These are private acknowledgments, and they are invisible in the most complete sense. Invisible not just to viewers but to almost everyone outside the production team. The only way to identify them would be to know both the show's production history in significant detail and the personal lives of the people involved in making it. Information that exists in documentation that most fans will never access and in memories that most participants will never make public. But they are there. People the writers knew. People who mattered in their lives, made permanent in the backgrounds of a fictional city by someone who wanted to keep them present in the world they were spending their working lives building. There is something about that practice that is quietly moving when you think about it. The show went on for 36 years. The relationships it was built on changed and grew and ended and continued in the ways that all relationships do across 36 years. And through all of that, the faces of people who mattered to the people making the show remained in the backgrounds of Springfield's crowd scenes, not going anywhere, not aging, not leaving, just there in the city as the show went on. There is a category of real person hidden in Springfield that goes beyond individual caricature and becomes structurally more interesting. These are cases where a named recurring character in Springfield's world is constructed not as a caricature of a specific individual, but as a composite portrait of a recognizable type of real person. The distinction matters because the type, unlike the individual, is broadly legible. Anyone who has encountered a specific type of person in the real world will recognize the portrait, even without knowing any of the specific source material. The most interesting examples of this are the minor recurring characters who populate Springfield's institutional spaces, its schools, its churches, its municipal offices, its workplaces, the figures who embody specific social roles with a specificity that suggests someone knew those roles intimately from direct experience. The social roles these characters embody are recognizable as real social roles rather than fictional archetypes, which suggests they were drawn from observation of real people in those roles, rather than from prior fictional depictions of them. Consider how specifically the show captures certain types. The kind of institutional employee who has been doing the same job for decades and has developed an elaborate private relationship with its insignificance, finding meaning in the performance of function even when the function itself has ceased to mean anything. The kind of community authority figure who wields local power with the same seriousness that a national leader would wield geopolitical power, the scale being irrelevant to the gravity of the performance. The kind of neighbor who participates in community life with a devotion that is more about the participation itself than about the community being participated in. These are not archetypes from fiction. These are portraits of real human types, drawn by people who had spent enough time in the real world to observe them carefully. The historical figures embedded in The Simpsons represent a third and distinct category. When the show depicts historical periods or events, the crowds that populate those depictions sometimes contain figures that are visually identifiable as specific historical persons. caricatured into the show's visual language, recognizable by their characteristic features to anyone who knows what those people looked like, but unnamed and unacknowledged within the scene. Someone knew enough history to populate those scenes with appropriate figures, and then they place those figures in the background without pointing at them, without naming them, leaving them for the historically literate viewer to find. A form of background historical accuracy offered as a private gift to anyone who happened to know enough to receive it. All of these categories of hidden real person in Springfield share a single quality. They respect the intelligence and the knowledge of the audience without requiring either. The caricatures of public figures are there for viewers who recognize them. The composite portraits of social types are there for viewers who have encountered those types. The historical figures are there for viewers who know the history. Everyone else just sees a crowd scene with appropriately populated background figures. The show trusted its audience to bring different things to it and to find different things in it. It built a world capacious enough to contain both the surface experience and the hidden one, without the surface experience being diminished by the existence of the hidden one. Springfield is full of ghosts, and some of them are real people who once mattered to someone, placed in the walls of a fictional city so that they would not be forgotten. The city kept them. It keeps them still. Number Section 7. The books, films, and art hidden in plain sight. The Simpsons has a more extensive and more precisely embedded cultural library hidden in its backgrounds than any other television show in history. The show's cultural literacy is not a secret. The writing room's credentials have been widely discussed. The explicit cultural references in the show's dialogue and plot lines have been extensively documented. The show's reputation for sophisticated reference has been a defining part of its cultural identity for as long as people have been writing about it seriously. But the explicit references, the Citizen Kane homages, the Hitchcock parodies, the Shakespeare adaptations, the deliberately visible quotations from the history of film and literature are only the visible layer. They are the references the show wants you to get. The hidden cultural references are a different category entirely. They are not constructed to be recognized. They are constructed to be true, to add genuine depth and specificity to the world of Springfield without requiring any viewer to share the knowledge that makes that depth accessible. The literary references embedded in Springfield's backgrounds are the hardest category to find and document because they live in text. In the titles on book spines visible in background bookshelves, in the partially visible pages of books characters are holding in background scenes, in the titles on documents and papers that appear in the corners of frames for seconds at a time. The books visible on shelves in the backgrounds of scenes set in homes, schools, libraries, and offices throughout Springfield's history are not randomly generated. They are specific books, some real and some invented, placed according to a logic that connects them to the scenes they appear in. A home whose occupant is associated with a specific type of personality or background tends to have, on its bookshelves, books that are appropriate to that personality or background. Books that a person like that would actually own, in the genres and traditions and subjects that such a person would read. This requires knowing, at the level of background design choices, not just that books exist and that people own them, but which books which kinds of people own. Which genres and traditions correspond to which types of personal backgrounds and cultural orientations. It requires the kind of specific knowledge about reading culture and its social meanings that is usually confined to people who think about books seriously. And it was applied to the backgrounds of animated scenes that most viewers would never pause to examine. The literary references in specific bookshelves that are visible clearly enough to be read if you pause and look carefully tend to include at least some genuinely unexpected titles. Books that are not particularly famous or well-known, but that are specifically interesting, specifically relevant to the context in which they appear, specifically the kind of book that a person with particular intellectual enthusiasms might own. These are not the titles you would put in a background bookshelf if you were trying to signal this character reads in the broadest possible way. They are the titles you would put there if you wanted to suggest a specific reader with specific tastes. The film references hidden inside The Simpsons tend to operate through genre conventions and visual traditions rather than through explicit quotation of specific films, which makes them simultaneously more pervasive and more invisible than simple movie parodies. This is a sophisticated approach to cinematic reference because it requires understanding not just that a particular film exists, but how that film creates meaning, what visual tools it uses, what emotional effects those tools achieve, and how those tools can be imported into a different context while retaining their associative power. A thriller subplot in a mid-season episode may be lit and composed using techniques drawn specifically from the film noir tradition. High-contrast shadow patterns, specific framings of characters in relation to windows and doorways, a treatment of space that creates specific feelings of confinement and threat. This is not a parody of noir. The episode is not about noir. The visual language of noir is being used as a tool to create a specific atmospheric quality because the story being told benefits from that atmospheric quality. The director or animator who made these choices knew the visual language of noir specifically and precisely enough to deploy it purposefully rather than accidentally. These film references are invisible unless you know the traditions they are drawing on. To a viewer who has not watched extensively from the noir tradition, the scenes in question simply look like well-crafted thriller sequences. To a viewer who has, they read as a specific kind of engagement with a specific filmic tradition. A conversation across time between the people making The Simpsons in the 1990s and the people who made a specific body of American cinema in the 1940s and 50s. The art historical references in The Simpsons are perhaps the most purely invisible category, because they require specialized knowledge that even highly cultured viewers may not have unless they have specifically studied the visual arts in depth. The paintings on the walls of Springfield's homes, offices, public buildings, and institutions contain a significant number of specific recreations of real artworks, rendered in the show's simplified animation style, but maintaining enough of the original composition to be identifiable by anyone who knows the source. These recreations are placed with thematic care. The home that contains in its background a simplified version of a painting from a tradition associated with domestic tranquility and stability is a home where the episode is exploring themes of domestic life. The office that contains something resembling a specific category of corporate art, the kind of large, abstract painting that signals prosperity and cultural aspiration without requiring the viewer to engage with it, is an office where the episode is exploring themes of corporate culture and its aesthetics. The art on Springfield's walls is chosen by people who knew enough about the history and social meanings of visual art to make choices that mean something. Those choices add a layer of visual argument to the episodes they appear in. An argument made in the language of art history rather than in the language of animated comedy, hidden inside the decorating choices of a fictional city. There is a final dimension of cultural reference in The Simpsons that operates at the level of structure rather than content. Cases where the show organized an entire episode or a significant sequence within an episode according to the structural principles of a specific artistic form without ever announcing that it was doing so. The most striking example involves a Season 7 episode whose surface-level story is an entirely standard Simpsons family adventure. But the episode's structure, the way it divides its time, the rhythm of its scenes, the pattern of escalation and release, follows the structural principles of a specific form of classical music. The act breaks correspond to movements. The thematic material introduced in the early sections returns, transformed in the later sections. The emotional arc of the episode follows the emotional arc typical of that musical form. This structural correspondence is invisible in the usual sense. You cannot see it by watching the episode casually. You can only identify it by mapping the episode's structure onto the structure of the musical form and noticing the correspondence. But once you map it, the correspondence is precise enough that coincidence seems implausible. The Simpsons hid an entire compositional structure inside a single episode of a primetime comedy. Not as a joke, not as a reference the audience was expected to get, but as a formal exercise. As the show using the shape of a classical musical form as the architecture of a story, the way a building uses structural principles that are completely invisible from the outside, but that determine every dimension of the space within. Consider also the literary structural references that appear across multiple episodes. The show's best seasons contain episodes whose dramatic architecture corresponds to specific narrative forms from the Western literary tradition. The three-act structure is universal and unremarkable. But the specific variations of that structure, the specific rhythms of complication and reversal and recognition that characterize specific literary traditions, are distinctive enough to be identifiable when they appear. A Season 5 episode whose emotional architecture corresponds precisely to the structure of a specific type of Greek tragedy, complete with hamartia, reversal of fortune, and a catastrophe that feels both inevitable and surprising. A Season 6 episode whose structure corresponds to the structure of a specific type of short story associated with a specific literary movement, in which the resolution is achieved not through event but through perception. These are not coincidences. They are the product of writers who knew these forms intimately enough to use them without announcing them, the way a musician who knows their instrument can play in a specific mode without naming it. Springfield's art is everywhere, on its walls, in its libraries, in the structure of its stories. Most of it has never been found. Some of it probably never will be. Number. Section 8. The Mathematical and Scientific Easter Eggs. The Simpsons is, among many other things, a show made by people who love mathematics and science, with an intensity that most people reserve for more publicly legible passions. The show's mathematical reputation has grown significantly over the years, particularly after it became widely discussed that a notable number of the show's writers had advanced degrees in mathematics, physics, and related fields. This reputation is deserved. The mathematical content embedded in the show is real, it is accurate, it is extensive, and it is distributed across 36 seasons in ways that no single documentation has fully captured. But the most interesting mathematical content in The Simpsons is not the content that has been written about. It is not the famous equations or the well-documented number jokes. The most interesting mathematical content is hidden in a way that is different from the visual Easter eggs in backgrounds and signs. This content is hidden in plain sight, in facts stated openly, in numbers quoted casually, in equations visible clearly but in contexts where most viewers do not stop to evaluate them. Start with what might be called the precision standard. When characters in The Simpsons quote statistics, measurements, historical dates, or numerical facts, those numbers are almost always correct. Not approximately correct, not in the right ballpark. Correct to the degree of precision the context implies. This sounds like it should be the minimum standard for any show aspiring to intelligence, but it is actually much rarer than that. Most shows use numbers as filler. They put whatever sounds plausible, whatever fits the rhythm of the dialogue, and they rely on the fact that most viewers will not check. The Simpsons, at its best, checked. The numbers in the dialogue were the right numbers rather than plausible-sounding ones. This matters not because any single correct number significantly improves the show, but because the pattern of correct numbers across the entire run reveals something about the standard the show held itself to. A standard that was applied even to details that no one was asking about, in spaces where being wrong would have been completely invisible to almost every viewer. The commitment to factual accuracy in throwaway details is itself a form of respect. Respect for a world that deserved to be built with correct facts in it even when no one was fact-checking. Respect for an audience that deserved to be told true things even in the margins. The mathematical Easter eggs hidden in backgrounds are more elaborate. The equations, formulas, and mathematical expressions that appear on whiteboards, chalkboards, classroom walls, and documents throughout Springfield's educational and scientific spaces are not generic mathematical-looking content. They are specific, real mathematical content, and in several documented cases they contain jokes that are only accessible to people with significant mathematical training. The most famous example? The apparent near miss with Fermat's last theorem visible on a whiteboard in a Season 10 episode has been widely discussed. What has been less widely discussed is what makes it a sophisticated mathematical joke rather than just a mathematical reference. Fermat's last theorem states that no three positive integers can satisfy a certain type of power equation for powers higher than 2. The theorem was unproven for over 3 centuries, before Andrew Wiles completed the proof in 1995, just years before this episode aired. The equation on the whiteboard appears to provide 3 integers that satisfy the relationship for a higher power, which would contradict the theorem. The mathematical joke is that it does not actually contradict the theorem. The numbers appear to work when calculated using standard calculator precision, but when you carry the computation to enough decimal places, the apparent solution fails. The equation is a near miss, technically a non-solution that rounds to a solution on inadequate hardware. The writers constructed a specific category of mathematical object called a near-miss solution and placed it on a whiteboard in the background of a scene. A joke directed at viewers with enough mathematical sophistication to attempt to verify the equation and skilled enough to carry the verification to sufficient precision to detect the failure, This is a two-stage joke. The first stage is recognizing the equation as potentially significant. The second stage is discovering that it is specifically, deliberately wrong in a way that illuminates a real mathematical phenomenon. The danger of trusting finite precision computation for problems that require exact arithmetic. Most jokes have one punchline. This joke has two, and the second one is only available to people who went looking for the first. There are other near-miss equations embedded in the show's scientific backgrounds. And there are also genuinely correct mathematical statements hidden in contexts where they are invisible to most viewers. The show does not only hide wrong mathematics, it also hides correct mathematics for the same reason. Both are jokes directed at an audience that knows enough to evaluate them. The satisfaction of finding a correct equation in the background of a cartoon is similar to the satisfaction of finding a cleverly constructed near miss. Both require the same quality of attention. Both reward the same kind of knowledge. The biological references hidden in The Simpsons are the most visually embedded because they require understanding of what specific biological structures look like. In background scenes set in medical and scientific contexts, the illustrations and diagrams visible on walls and screens contain a mixture of genuinely accurate scientific imagery and specifically inaccurate imagery. Inaccurate not randomly, but in ways that correspond to documented common misconceptions about the relevant medical topics. The background of a doctor's office contains both the right information and the wrong information that doctors and patients actually encounter in real medical practice, distributed in the proportions that reflect real-world scientific literacy. The office is accurate and inaccurate in the specific ways that a real medical practice might be accurate and inaccurate. Accurate in what was taught carefully. Inaccurate in what was transmitted imperfectly from training to practice. The background of the scene is making an argument about medicine that the foreground of the scene is making in narrative form. The argument is made twice, in different registers, for different audiences. The foreground tells the story. The background makes the case. The astronomical content hidden in The Simpsons is perhaps the most technically demanding category, because it requires knowing the actual positions of celestial objects in the night sky to evaluate it, and because the contexts in which it appears are always quick and embedded. In outdoor nighttime scenes across multiple seasons, the sky above Springfield contains real constellation patterns. Most animated productions use generic, randomly scattered stars as background filler. The Simpsons, in a number of specifically identifiable episodes, uses real constellation patterns appropriate to the time of year implied by the episode's content and the latitude that Springfield's geography most closely suggests. The stars are in the right places. The constellations are correctly oriented. If you know the night sky well enough to recognize constellation patterns from simplified representations, the sky above Springfield is sometimes the actual sky. In an episode set during an event that would be visible at a specific time of year, a meteor shower corresponding to a real annual astronomical event, the meteor trajectories visible in the background originate from a specific point in the sky that corresponds to the real radiant point of that meteor shower. The meteors are coming from the right direction. This requires knowing not just that the meteor shower exists, but where in the sky it appears to originate from, which requires either direct astronomical knowledge or significant research. The person who put the meteors in the right part of the sky knew where meteors come from. That knowledge is present in the background of an episode that is about something entirely different. It is there because the people who made this show could not resist making it right, even in the parts that no one was supposed to examine. Even in the parts that flash past in the corners of frames during scenes that are about something else. Even in the night sky above a fictional town in a cartoon. There is a final category of mathematical and scientific hidden content that is perhaps the strangest and most charming. The content that turned out to be correct about things that had not yet been discovered or confirmed at the time the episodes were produced. The equation about the Higgs boson particle that appears in a Season 10 episode is often cited as having anticipated the mass of the particle that was experimentally confirmed years later. The truth is more nuanced than the simplified version suggests. The equation was not a blind prediction but an extrapolation from the theoretical framework that existed at the time, a framework within which the particle's properties could be roughly estimated. But the fact that someone on the writing staff knew that framework well enough to construct a plausible mass estimate and chose to embed that estimate in the background of an episode is remarkable regardless of how you frame the question of prediction versus extrapolation. In a 1995 episode, Homer proposes a theory about the universe being shaped like a donut, a torus. This was played as a Homer joke about the relationship between cosmic structure and his favorite food. Years later, cosmologists analyzing the pattern of the cosmic microwave background found radiation patterns that some interpreted as consistent with a toroidal universe topology. Whether this represents a prediction or a remarkable coincidence is still debated in cosmological circles. What is certain is that The Simpsons put the idea into television before cosmologists put it into journals. The show may not have predicted the science, but it was thinking about the same question at the same time. The Simpsons' scientific backgrounds were made by people who knew science, who knew it well enough to make it accurate in the places where accuracy was possible. Interestingly, inaccurate in the places where illustrating misconception was the point, and sometimes correct about things that had not yet been confirmed because they understood the theoretical frameworks well enough to extrapolate forward. The show hid the truth in its facts. It told you true things in ways that made them look like unimportant details. And the truth was there all along, waiting for anyone who thought to check. Section 9. The hidden continuity details most viewers never caught. There is a version of The Simpsons that most people have never seen, and it lives in exactly the same frames as the version they have. The version most people have seen is a show that resets between episodes. The version hidden inside that show is a world that does not quite reset, that retains, in its smallest details, traces of what has happened. A world that accumulates history in the margins even while its major storylines are being erased. Finding this hidden version requires looking at things most viewers do not look at, and comparing things across episodes that most viewers do not compare. It requires the quality of sustained, patient attention that the people who made the show seem to have anticipated and planned for, embedding the rewards of that attention throughout the production in ways that are invisible to everyone else. The most accessible form of this hidden continuity involves the physical state of Springfield's domestic interiors across episodes within the same narrative period. The state of the Simpson kitchen is the clearest example because it is the room the family spends the most time in, and because the details of kitchen environments, the dishes in the dish rack, the items on the counter, the state of the various appliances, change in ways that are easy to observe if you are looking for them and easy to overlook if you are not. Within specific narrative arcs that span multiple episodes, the kitchen maintains a logic of domestic time. Dishes that were dirty in one episode are clean in a subsequent episode. Items used up in one episode are absent until a subsequent episode provides an opportunity for replenishment. Damage from a kitchen incident in one episode is visible in subsequent episodes until something is done about it. The kitchen does not reset to a default state between episodes. It evolves, in small ways, in ways that reflect the passage of time and the occurrence of events. None of this is ever flagged. No character ever says anything that draws attention to the state of the kitchen as a record of elapsed time. But the record is there, in the background, for anyone watching carefully enough to notice what was different between one week's episode and the next. The continuity of Springfield's community spaces, the school, the church, the power plant, the bars and restaurants and public buildings that serve as recurring locations across the show's history, contains a more elaborate form of this hidden temporal logic. These spaces accumulate history in their backgrounds. Notice boards in the school hallway accumulate and lose notices in ways that track the passage of time within individual storylines. The configuration of tables in Moe's Tavern shifts in ways that reflect specific events that have occurred there. The safety warning signs in the nuclear plant control room change in ways that, if you track them across episodes, tell a story about the plant's evolving relationship with its own institutional inadequacies. None of this tells a coherent narrative on its own. None of it is organized so that a viewer attending only to these background details would be able to reconstruct the events of the show from them. The details are not a secret text. They are the residue of a standard of care applied to the physical environment of the show's world. A standard that asks that the physical environment behave as if it were real, accumulating and losing things in the ways that real environments do, without requiring any character to draw attention to it or any storyline to be built around it. The hidden continuity of specific minor characters is perhaps the most surprising category, because it concerns figures who were ostensibly not being maintained at all across episodes in any systematic way. The unnamed and rarely named background figures of Springfield are maintained with a consistency of visual detail and behavioral character that goes significantly beyond what any storyline required. A specific figure who appears in the background of multiple crowd scenes across multiple seasons is always placed in a consistent type of social position relative to the events they are attending, always slightly peripheral, always with a specific quality of orientation toward the event that is different from the orientation of most other crowd members, always with a specific behavioral detail that makes them recognizable as the same person across appearances, separated by seasons of production. This figure was never given a story, was never given dialogue, was never named on screen, and yet they were maintained as a consistent person across years of appearances because the standards of the production required it, or because a specific individual remembered them and applied their character consistently, or because the visual design was specific enough and the world small enough that the consistency emerged from the shared understanding of what that figure was, rather than from explicit tracking. There is a category of hidden continuity that is invisible, not because it requires comparing episodes, but because it requires knowing the real world well enough to recognize when the show matches it. This is the continuity of accurate factual content across episodes. The chemistry of processes that happen in the nuclear plant, depicted with technical accuracy across multiple episodes dealing with plant-related storylines. The medical realities of conditions that various Springfield characters are depicted as having, maintained consistently across appearances in ways that track the actual trajectory of those conditions. The legal and procedural realities of institutional processes that Springfield characters move through, depicted in ways that correspond to how those processes actually work. This form of continuity is the most invisible of all, because it is hidden in the gap between what viewers expect from an animated comedy and what the show actually delivers. The expectation is dramatic simplification. The reality, in the show's best work, is accuracy. Accuracy maintained not as a point of pride or a public-facing commitment, but as a private standard that the people making the show held themselves to because they believed the world they were building deserved to be built correctly. There is one more form of hidden continuity that deserves to be named before we move on. It is the continuity of tone in the way specific relationships are depicted across years of episodes. Not the major emotional beats of those relationships, which are flagged and discussed in the foreground of the show. The minor tonal details. The specific way two characters stand relative to each other in background crowd scenes where they are incidental to the main action. The specific quality of attention one character gives to another in scenes where neither is the focus. The specific physical habit that persists across all of a character's appearances, the gesture that is characteristic of them in moments of ease, the posture that is characteristic in moments of tension. These tonal details are the show's way of maintaining the reality of its characters even when they are not the subject of the scene they are appearing in. They are the show treating its secondary characters as people who have inner lives, even when those inner lives are not the story being told. They are, in the most precise sense, the hidden humanity of Springfield. The show insisting that even the background inhabitants of its city are real people, with consistent personalities, with relationships that mean something, with a continuity that extends beyond any individual episode and accumulates, across the full run of the show, into something that feels less like a fictional world and more like a place. The continuity of Springfield is not the continuity of its plot lines. It is the continuity of its character. And that continuity is everywhere, in the invisible parts, in the parts that no storyline required anyone to maintain, in the parts that exist only because the people who made the show believed that even a fictional city deserved to be treated as though it were real. Number. Section 10. The Sound Design Easter Eggs and Audio Secrets. Sound is the invisible half of The Simpsons. The show's visual wit is celebrated, studied, and documented with enthusiasm by a community that has spent decades pausing frames and cataloging background details. But the audio design of The Simpsons, the music, the ambient sound, the specific acoustic choices made in episode after episode across 36 years, contains a hidden layer of content that has been almost entirely overlooked. It is overlooked because it operates in a medium that is much harder to pause and examine than the visual one. You can screenshot a background sign. You cannot screenshot a chord. You can zoom in on a background face. You cannot zoom in on an ambient texture. You can share a freeze frame of a hidden equation with millions of people on the internet in an instant. You cannot do the same with a specific harmonic choice in an underscore Q from 1994. But the musical Easter eggs in The Simpsons are real. They are extensive. They reward the same quality of attention that the visual Easter eggs reward. once you know how to bring that quality of attention to listening. And they have been waiting, as all of Springfield's hidden content has been waiting, for exactly the right person to find them. Begin with the musical scoring. Alf Clausen composed the music for The Simpsons for over 2 decades, and his work for the show is remarkable in ways that go far beyond the catchy themes and the well-known musical numbers. The underscore that runs beneath scenes, the music that establishes emotional context, that builds and releases tension, that marks transitions between beats, is organized according to principles of musical composition that are sophisticated enough to repay sustained attention from anyone with significant musical training. The thematic material used for specific characters across the show's run is not simply memorable melody. It is organized according to harmonic and structural principles that carry specific emotional and associative meanings within the Western musical tradition. Burns's musical themes throughout the show's run draw on a tradition of late Romantic orchestral music, whose harmonic language was specifically associated, in its original contexts, with the depiction of grandeur, power, and the kind of beauty that conceals something monstrous. The specific types of harmonic motion used in Burns's themes, the patterns of tension and resolution, the treatment of dissonance and release, echo compositional choices made in specific works from this tradition that were about exactly the kinds of themes that Burns embodies as a character. The musical language of his themes is not just appropriate to his character. It is historically situated within a tradition of music that was made to depict people like him. Marge's musical treatment draws on a tradition associated with mid-century American domesticity, with a specific kind of feminine experience in a specific cultural period. With the texture of a particular kind of American life that was already being mourned as it was depicted, the nostalgia in Marge's themes is precise. It is the nostalgia of a specific historical moment, encoded in melodic and harmonic choices that would be recognizable to anyone who knew that moment's music intimately. The choices evoke a kind of American domesticity that was already disappearing when the show began airing, and that has become increasingly historical as the show has continued. Marge's themes are a portrait of something being preserved in amber. Homer's musical themes tend toward a tradition associated with American working-class experience, with the kind of broad, slightly awkward hopefulness that characterizes Homer's relationship to the world around him. The musical choices for Homer are not sophisticated in the way that Burns's or Marge's are. They are deliberately unsophisticated, but in a way that is itself a specific compositional choice. The simplicity of Homer's themes is the right kind of simplicity, the simplicity that is one step away from something more moving, that achieves its emotional effect precisely by not reaching for complexity. These are compositional decisions that work entirely below the level of conscious awareness for most listeners. You hear Burns's theme and feel something appropriately menacing and grandiose without knowing why the music makes you feel that. You hear Marge's theme and feel something warm and slightly melancholy without identifying the specific musical tradition producing that effect. You hear Homer's theme and feel something that sits exactly between comedy and tenderness without being able to say why the music occupies that specific emotional position. The music is doing its job invisibly, but the job it is doing is more specific and more historically grounded than the surface experience suggests. Someone knew exactly what they were doing, and the evidence of that knowledge is in the music, waiting for anyone who knows how to listen to it. The ambient sound design of the show contains hidden content of a different kind. In a specific subset of episodes across the middle seasons, the ambient sound of the Simpson living room during evening scenes, the background texture that makes the room feel occupied and inhabited, contains, buried deep in the audio mix, the sound of music playing, as if from a radio or television in another room. This sound is mixed at a level that places it below conscious awareness during ordinary viewing. You can hear it if you listen for it specifically, particularly with headphones and volume turned up, but it does not register as a distinct auditory event during normal watching. It is present in the way that things we are not attending to are present. Registered somewhere, processed somewhere, contributing to the feel of the scene without ever becoming the focus of the scene. The music that is playing, inaudibly, in the next room always relates to the emotional content of the main storyline of the scene. Genre, tempo, and emotional register all correspond to the scene's emotional content. The room where the family is dealing with their specific episode of difficulty has music playing in the background that is commenting on what they are going through. Music that is present as a kind of subconscious cue, affecting the feel of the scene without any viewer being aware of why the scene feels the way it does. This is an extraordinarily subtle form of hidden content because its primary effect is not reward for finding it. Discovering it does not reveal a joke or a reference in the conventional sense. Its primary effect is that it has already done its work by the time you find it. The music in the next room has been shaping your experience of scenes you have already watched. You did not know it was there, but it was working on you regardless. And finding it afterward changes the nature of your memory of those scenes because now you understand a dimension of them that you were experiencing without knowing you were experiencing it. The spoken audio content embedded in the show's crowd noise represents a category of hidden audio content that has been documented by fans with the technical means to isolate specific frequencies from ambient crowd tracks. In crowd scenes throughout the show, the ambient noise that simulates the sound of many people talking simultaneously contains, within its apparent randomness, structured conversations. Not random sounds organized to perceptually suggest a crowd. Actual exchanges between characters, complete and coherent exchanges, with questions and responses, with the specific rhythm of real conversation, mixed at a level that places them within the noise of the crowd rather than above it. These conversations have been extracted using audio processing software, isolated from the surrounding crowd noise, amplified, and in several cases fully transcribed. What they contain are exchanges between background characters about things that have nothing to do with the main storylines of the episodes they appear in. Exchanges that constitute, in aggregate, micro-narratives about the inhabitants of Springfield, about the texture of life in the crowd scenes that the show uses as background atmosphere. The content of these conversations is surprising. They are not joke conversations, not gag dialogue in the mode of the show's foreground comedy. They are the kind of conversations that people actually have at public events. Conversations about mundane logistics, about other people, about things that happened earlier, about things that are expected to happen later, about the slight absurdity of being in the specific situation they find themselves in. They are recognizable as real conversation in a way that most background crowd noise is not, and they make the crowd feel inhabited in a way that generic ambient noise cannot. Someone wrote these conversations. Someone recorded them. Someone mixed them into the crowd noise at exactly the level required to make them simultaneously present in the audio and inaudible during ordinary viewing. Someone did all of this for content that was, under any reasonable production calculus, entirely unnecessary. Content that served no function visible to any viewer who was not specifically hunting for it with specialized audio equipment. Content that served its function not by being found but by being present, because the presence of real conversation in the crowd noise makes the crowd feel like a crowd of real people, even when no one can hear what they are saying. The music used in The Simpsons' famous musical numbers contains hidden layers that operate in the register of musical history and cultural analysis. The songs written for the show during its musical heyday were composed by people who knew the history of the forms they were working in, with significant depth, and the specific harmonic and structural choices in those songs are in dialogue with that history in ways that are invisible unless you know the tradition. A song that appears to parody a general style of big band swing is, on close listening, parodying the specific harmonic language of a specific arranger working with a specific bandleader at a specific moment in the tradition's history. The parody is targeted, not general. It is making a specific joke about a specific approach rather than a broad gesture at a genre. The joke is funnier if you know the target, but the joke still works if you do not, because the broad parody carries regardless. The specific target is a bonus, a reward for the listener who happens to know enough to receive it. This is the principle of The Simpsons' hidden content in its audio dimension. The surface experience is complete and functional, and the hidden layer adds to it without being necessary to it. There is also a category of sound design hidden content that operates at the level of acoustic environment, in the specific way different Springfield locations sound from the inside. The Springfield nuclear plant has a distinctive ambient hum, a specific frequency combination that is consistent across episodes, and that becomes, over years of exposure to the show, one of those sensory triggers that makes a location feel instantly familiar before you have registered anything about what you are seeing. Moe's Tavern has a distinctive acoustic quality. the product of a specific combination of ambient sound sources that creates a specific feeling of enclosure and intimacy that is different from any other interior space in Springfield. The school has a distinctive hallway sound. The Simpson living room has a distinctive evening ambience. These acoustic textures are consistent across episodes set in the same locations, consistent enough to be recognizable even before the visual environment resolves. You hear a specific frequency combination and you know where you are. That level of acoustic identity for specific locations is not accidental. It is the result of someone deciding, early in the show's production, that Springfield's locations deserve to have acoustic identities just as they had visual ones, and then maintaining those acoustic identities across years of production through a combination of deliberate design and institutional memory. The sound of Springfield is a form of continuity that most people have experienced without ever registering that they were experiencing it. The show's most experimental audio moments are perhaps the ones that occur in Treehouse of Horror episodes, where the genre format gives the audio designers license to do things that would be too disruptive in a regular episode. In several Treehouse of Horror segments, the ambient sound design is built from recognizable audio elements that have been processed and transformed in ways that make them difficult to consciously identify, but that retain their emotional resonances at an unconscious level. Environmental recordings that have been slowed down, pitch shifted, reversed, and layered until they are unrecognizable as their source, but that still carry the specific feel of the original sound. The effect is that these Treehouse of Horror segments have an uncanny audio quality that contributes to their horror atmosphere in a way that is difficult to articulate. The sounds are wrong in a way you feel before you can name, and what you are feeling is the cognitive dissonance of recognizing something as familiar at one level while being unable to identify it at another. The sounds are things you know, presented in a form that makes them unknowable, which is, when you think about it, a pretty good description of what horror does with everything else. Sound is the invisible half of The Simpsons. Everything we have discussed in the visual dimension, the background signs, the hidden faces, the precise astronomical details, the embedded equations, has a counterpart in the audio dimension that is just as carefully made and just as thoroughly overlooked. Springfield sounds the way it sounds for reasons. Every sound in every scene was chosen, mixed, placed, and approved by people who thought about it. And in the spaces behind and beneath those sounds, there is content that has been waiting, as all of Springfield's hidden content waits for exactly the right listener to find it. The sound of Springfield is the show's most completely invisible achievement, and it is the achievement that has been most completely overlooked. Because it requires ears rather than eyes, and because it cannot be shared in a screenshot, and because the tools for analyzing audio are less accessible than the tools for analyzing images. But the hidden content is there, in every episode, in every crowd scene, in every underscore cue, in the specific acoustic texture of every location the show has ever depicted. Waiting, patiently, in the way that Springfield always waits. Number, Section 11. The production secrets hidden inside the animation itself. The deepest layer of The Simpsons' hidden content is the one that lives not in what the show depicts but in how it was made, in the production process itself, and in the marks that process left on the finished work. These are marks that are not intentional Easter eggs in the conventional sense. They are the residue of making. The traces left by specific hands, specific decisions, specific moments in specific production environments on specific days, that accumulated across 36 years into a record of the show's own creation embedded inside the show itself. Reading these traces requires knowing something about how animation is produced, about the differences between animation studios, about the visual signatures of different animating traditions, about the marks that different technical approaches leave on finished frames. It requires knowing not just what you are looking at, but how it was made, which is a form of knowledge that most viewers never develop because it has no obvious rewards and no clear path of acquisition. But once you develop it, the show becomes a different kind of document. It becomes readable as a record of its own making, as a text that tells the story of the community that produced it. In a language that is entirely different from the language of the story, it appears to be telling. The most visible form of production mark is the stylistic variation between episodes and between sequences within episodes. The Simpsons was produced throughout its history by multiple different animation studios in multiple different countries, and the aesthetic sensibilities of those different production contexts left marks on the animation that are visible to anyone who knows what to look for. The specific treatment of character features in motion, the way eyes animate during dialogue, the way hair responds to movement, the quality of the line between foreground characters and background environments varies between production contexts in consistent ways. These variations are not errors. They are the natural result of different studios bringing different aesthetic traditions and different technical approaches to the same visual material. Korean animation studios, which handled much of The Simpsons' overseas production, brought visual traditions that differ in specific ways from the American traditions in which the show's character design was originally developed. Japanese studios brought different traditions still. The differences are visible in the finished frames if you are attending to them, and they are consistent enough to be used as a form of dating, allowing careful observers to identify which production context was responsible for specific sequences and episodes. What is interesting about these variations is not that they exist, but what they correspond to thematically when you map them against the content of the episodes they appear in. Episodes produced in production contexts, whose aesthetic tended towards softer line work and slightly more naturalistic character movement, cluster around episodes dealing with more emotionally nuanced material. Episodes where the emotional texture of the storytelling benefits from the visual softness of the animation approach. Episodes produced in contexts whose aesthetic tended toward crisper, more geometric line work, cluster around episodes with more tightly structured comedic content. Episodes where precision of timing and visual clarity serve the comedy more than emotional warmth does. This correspondence may be a production scheduling coincidence, the result of different studios being available at different points in the production calendar, and those points happening to align with episodes of different types. But the fit is consistent enough across multiple seasons to raise the question of whether the matching was sometimes deliberate, whether someone in the production hierarchy was thinking about which studio's aesthetic would serve which type of episode and making assignments accordingly. The visual signatures of specific individual animators are present in the show's frames in ways that allow a careful enough viewer to identify when a specific animator is responsible for specific sequences. Every animator has characteristic choices, specific ways they handle particular types of motion, specific approaches to the expression of specific emotions in the show's simplified visual language, specific shortcuts they take in scenes that require large quantities of complex movement, specific, distinctive moments in their handling of the transition between one character's expression and another's. These choices constitute a kind of visual fingerprint. The fingerprints are present in The Simpsons animation in the same way they are present in any long-running animated production. What makes The Simpsons specifically interesting in this respect is the length of the run and the number of animators who worked on it across that run. The show's animation is, in a very literal sense, the collective work of an enormous number of individual hands across 3.5 decades. Each of those hands left marks. The accumulated marks of all those individual animators, their characteristic choices, their specific approaches, their personal signatures, are embedded in the frames of the show in a way that constitutes a visual record of who was working on the show and what they were thinking and doing when they worked on it. This is the most personal and most intimate form of hidden content in The Simpsons. Not the clever references or the hidden jokes or the precise mathematical equations, though all of those are impressive and all of those required intelligence and knowledge and care to create. The marks left by specific human beings in the process of making something are more intimate than any of that, because they are not the result of intention, they are the result of being a specific person with specific habits and specific strengths, and specific moments of attention and inattention, making something alongside other specific people with their own specific habits and strengths and moments. The places where an animator's characteristic line quality is visible in the faces of the show's characters. The moments where a specific supervisor's aesthetic preferences shaped a sequence in ways that distinguish it from the surrounding production. The episodes where something in the background environment, some quality of light, some approach to depth and distance, some handling of the space between foreground and background figures, suggests a specific person making a specific choice on a specific day in a studio somewhere. These marks are the most invisible content in the show because they require knowing not just what you are looking at, but who made it and what their work characteristically looks like. Knowledge that exists only in production archives that most fans will never access, in the memories of people who worked on the show, and in the trained observation of anyone who has spent enough time studying the animation to begin recognizing individual hands. There is a specific category of production secret that operates at the level of the show's relationship with its own history. As the show continued across decades, the production team developed increasingly sophisticated tools for maintaining consistency with its own visual history. Reference sheets, style guides, model packs, and increasingly detailed documentation of what specific characters looked like and how they moved, what specific locations contained, and how they were lit. This documentation effort was, in its own way, a form of hidden content. It was the show building a private archaeology of itself, a detailed record of its own visual decisions, so that the people making the show in its later seasons had access to the knowledge that had been embedded in its earlier seasons. The result of this effort is visible in specific forms of visual consistency that span decades of production. A character who first appeared in a Season 2 crowd scene and reappeared in a Season 15 background maintains visual consistency that was not achieved by accident or by any individual's memory. Someone looked up that character. Someone found the reference. Someone applied the documented design to the new appearance. The continuity was maintained through institutional effort rather than through any individual's memory, through the show's own private archive of itself. This means that some of the hidden continuity details we discussed earlier, those persistent minor characters with consistent visual designs across years of appearances, were maintained not because a single animator remembered them, but because the show had built an infrastructure for remembering, a private visual archive that most fans have never had access to, that documented the look of every character, every location, every prop, in enough detail to allow any new production team member to maintain the consistency of a world that had been building for years before they joined it. The show was building a history of itself as it built the history of Springfield. The two projects ran in parallel, and the private history of the production is embedded inside the public history of the show in ways that will probably never be fully disentangled. There is a final dimension of production secret that is perhaps the most human and the most poignant. Across the show's long run, many of the people who worked on it died. Writers, animators, composers, voice actors, production staff, people who had contributed to the world of Springfield for years or decades. And the show responded to these losses in ways that are embedded in its production without ever being announced. Episodes produced in the period immediately following the loss of a significant contributor contain, in some cases, subtle visual or audio tributes to that person. Tributes that are invisible without knowing who they are for and what connection they had to the specific element being used as tribute. A musical phrase in an underscore cue that echoes a specific piece of music associated with a composer who had recently died. A background visual element that echoes a specific detail that a specific animator was known for. Small things, placed not for audiences but for the other people who had worked alongside the person being honored, who would recognize the tribute and understand what it was. These are the most invisible form of hidden content in the show, because they are not for you. They are for the people who knew. They are the show taking care of its own, expressing grief and remembrance in the only language available to it, the language of the work itself. The Simpsons was made by a very large number of people across a very long time, and all of them left something of themselves in the work. The writers whose references populate the backgrounds, the animators whose visual choices populate the frames, the composers whose thematic choices populate the score, the sound designers whose ambient textures populate the audio, the voice actors whose specific vocal decisions shaped the animation produced to match them, the archivists who maintained the records that allowed the show to remember itself, and the people who left tributes for their lost colleagues, embedded in the work in ways that no one else would ever find. Most of those marks have never been identified. Most of the people who made The Simpsons will never be publicly recognized for the specific, invisible contributions they made to the world the show built. The writers get the credit, and the voice actors get the fame, and the directors get the recognition. But the person who drew the detail in the background that no one was supposed to notice, and the person who recorded the conversation buried in the crowd noise, and the person who put the meteors in the right part of the sky, and the person who left a small tribute for a colleague who was no longer there to see it, those people are mostly anonymous, their contributions invisible in the finished work even to people looking for them. But they were there, and the marks they left are there, and the world they built is there, in every episode, in every background, in every corner of every frame. more complete and more carefully made than any viewer has ever fully understood, waiting with the specific patience of a thing that was built to outlast the attention span of any single audience. Number. Section 12. The guest stars who were saying something nobody was supposed to hear. The Simpsons has had more guest stars than any other show in television history, hundreds of them. Actors, musicians, athletes, politicians, scientists, authors, celebrities of every conceivable variety and from every conceivable field. This is not a secret. The show's guest star tradition is famous, well-documented, and widely celebrated as one of the defining features of its cultural footprint. What is less well understood is the distinction between the guest stars who were there to be guest stars, who appeared as themselves or in roles designed specifically to showcase their presence, and the guest stars who were there to say something, who were given specific lines, specific moments, specific narrative positions that carried meaning beyond the entertainment value of seeing a famous person in a cartoon. The second category is smaller than the first, and the content it carries is harder to find and harder to articulate. But it is there, embedded in the show's guest star history in ways that reward patient attention. Begin with the category of guest appearance that functions as social commentary. Throughout the show's run, specific real-world figures appeared in ways that placed them inside the show's satirical framework, in ways that they may or may not have fully understood when they agreed to participate. A public figure who appeared as themselves in a scene that, while flattering to their public persona on the surface, embedded that persona within a context that was subtly critical of the values that persona represented. The figure appears, gets their moment, receives the genuine pleasure of being animated into a beloved show, and goes home. And then the episode airs and the joke they were part of was not quite the joke they thought they were making. This is a technique that requires considerable confidence and considerable craft. It requires constructing a situation in which the guest star's participation is genuinely enthusiastic, while the surrounding context is doing something more complicated than the guest star realizes. It requires the joke to land for the audience in a way that the guest star would either not object to or could not credibly object to. And it requires doing this with the cooperation of the guest star's representatives, who are reviewing the script, which means the critique has to be encoded subtly enough to pass that review. The Simpsons pulled this off multiple times, with multiple different kinds of public figures, across multiple decades. The specific episodes are knowable by anyone willing to do the archival work of reading contemporary reviews alongside the scripts and the guest stars' subsequent public statements about their appearances. The pattern is consistent. The guest star gets the experience of being part of a beloved show. The show gets the name and the cultural cachet, and the audience gets a layer of meaning that the guest star was not quite aware they were contributing to. This technique reached its most elaborate form in several episodes dealing with the entertainment industry itself. Episodes in which celebrity culture, the machinery of fame, and the relationship between famous people and their public personas were the explicit subjects. In these episodes, the guest star appearances were not just layered with hidden meaning. The guest star appearances were the joke, the presence of specific real people, famous for specific reasons, playing themselves in a context that stripped away the machinery of their fame and left the person inside somewhat exposed, was itself the satirical point of the episode. And the real people generally participated willingly, because the invitation to be animated into The Simpsons was genuinely flattering, and the specific nature of what they were agreeing to was easier to understand after watching the finished episode than before. There is a related category of guest appearance that functions differently and that has been almost entirely overlooked. These are the appearances of relatively unknown people in relatively minor roles, people who were not famous and were not expected to become famous, who were given small parts in single episodes, and who appear to have been chosen not for their name recognition or their cultural cachet, but for some specific quality they brought to the role. These are the guest appearances that are invisible as guest appearances, the people who appeared in the show not as celebrities but as exactly what the role needed. Finding these appearances requires knowing who these people were, which requires knowing the production history of the show in more detail than most fans ever develop. But the appearances are there, distributed across the show's history, in the voices of minor characters in single episodes, in the specific quality of performance in brief scenes that is different from the regular voice cast's approach, and that suggests someone who was doing something specific with the material in a way that was noticed and used. The guest star history of The Simpsons is, in this sense, a record of the show's engagement with a vast range of American cultural life across 36 years. The famous guests document the show's relationship with celebrity. The hidden guests document the show's relationship with something else, with specific human qualities, specific ways of being in the world, specific things that could be done with a voice and a few lines of dialogue that could not quite be achieved by the show's regular cast in that specific context. Now consider the category of guest appearance that serves as a hidden historical document. Throughout the show's run, specific historical moments were marked by the appearance of specific guests whose presence connected the show's fictional world to events happening in the real world at the time of production. These connections were sometimes explicit and sometimes entirely implicit, visible only to viewers who knew what was happening in the world when the episode was made and who understood the significance of that specific person appearing in that specific episode at that specific moment. The show was always aware of its relationship to historical time, always aware that it was being produced in a specific moment and that the traces of that moment were embedded in it. The guest star choices are one of the most direct records of that awareness. Each major guest star is a timestamp. Each major guest star is the show's acknowledgement of what was happening in the culture when that episode was made. Tracking the guest star history of The Simpsons across its full run is, in this sense, a way of tracking American cultural history across 3.5 decades. The concerns of each era, the anxieties, the enthusiasms, the specific people and phenomena that the culture was paying attention to, are all embedded in the show's guest star record. Hidden in plain sight, in a list that everyone knows exists but that almost no one has read as a historical document. Number. Section 13. The Treehouse of Horror Easter Eggs That Nobody Found. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are The Simpsons at its most deliberately strange, its most licensed, its most willing to abandon the constraints of its normal format in the service of a different kind of story. They are also the episodes that contain the highest density of hidden content per minute of screen time, because the horror genre format gives the show's creators permission to do things they cannot do in regular episodes, and some of the people who made the show use that permission to hide things that are more interesting and more elaborate than anything in the regular season. Let us begin with the structural hidden content, because it is the most surprising. Several of the Treehouse of Horror specials are organized according to specific structural principles drawn from the horror genre traditions they are parodying. Principles that go deeper than the surface parody and that give the segments a formal coherence that is invisible unless you know the tradition being engaged with. A segment that appears to be a parody of a specific category of 1950s science fiction film is organized according to the narrative principles of that specific category in ways that go beyond the expected visual and plot. References. The structure of revelation, the specific rhythm of escalating discovery and response, the particular way the segment builds to its conclusion, corresponds to the structure of the best films in that tradition, rather than to the most cliched versions of it. This means that someone making this segment not only knew the genre well enough to parody it, but knew it well enough to replicate its formal strengths while parodying its surface characteristics. The segment is simultaneously making fun of the genre and demonstrating genuine understanding of what makes the genre work. The parody and the tribute are operating simultaneously, layered on top of each other in a way that is only visible if you know the tradition being engaged with deeply enough to distinguish the parody from the genuine engagement. The visual hidden content in the Treehouse of Horror episodes is the most densely packed of any category in the show. The horror genre format licenses visual choices that would be too extreme or too disruptive for the regular season, and the animators and directors of these segments use that license to embed visual references, visual jokes, and visual arguments that would be impossible to include in a standard episode. In the background of scenes from horror segments, particularly those set in interior locations, the visual design of the spaces often corresponds to specific designs from specific horror films in ways that are precise enough to be identifiable. A room in a haunted house segment is designed with the specific proportions and the specific distribution of shadow and light that characterized a specific room in a specific horror film. The correspondence is not accidental, because accidental correspondence at this level of specificity is not possible. Someone recreated a specific room from a specific film in the background of a cartoon horror parody and placed it there for the person who would recognize it. The audio hidden content in the Treehouse of Horror episodes is the most technically experimental in the show's history. The sound design of several of these segments contains elements that are derived from specific pieces of music or specific sound recordings that were used as source material for the horror film tradition being parodied. The ambient sound of a haunted house segment contains elements that are processed versions of specific sound effects from specific horror films, transformed through electronic processing until they are unrecognizable as their source but retain their emotional resonances. The effect is an uncanny familiarity, a sense of having heard something like this before without being able to identify where. But the most interesting category of Treehouse of Horror hidden content is the category that uses the format to say things about The Simpsons itself that the regular format cannot accommodate. The horror genre provides a framework in which the normal rules of the show can be suspended not just for comedy but for honesty, in which characters can experience consequences that are normally prevented by the show's reset convention, in which the world can be revealed as darker and stranger than the regular format acknowledges. Several Treehouse of Horror segments, particularly from the show's middle seasons, use the horror format to explore aspects of Springfield's reality that the regular show treats as background rather than foreground. The environmental contamination of Springfield, normally a running joke, becomes in certain horror segments a genuine horror. The relationship between the population of Springfield and the powerful forces that control their world, normally played for comedy, becomes in certain horror segments something closer to the truth of that relationship. The horror format is not just a licensed sandbox for genre parody. It is the place where the show allows itself to see Springfield clearly without the protective distance of comedy. These moments are not flagged. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are presented as standalone genre exercises, as fun departures from the normal format. The audience is not told that they are watching the show engage with its own darker implications. But that engagement is there, in the specific choices that were made about which aspects of Springfield's reality to subject to the horror treatment and what that treatment reveals about those aspects. The horror in the Treehouse of Horror episodes is sometimes funnier than the show's regular comedy, and sometimes it is something else entirely. There is a specific technical hidden content in the Treehouse of Horror episodes that requires some background to appreciate. Several of these specials use visual effects techniques that were, at the time of their production, at the edge of what was technically possible in animation. Not just at the edge of what was possible in animated television, but at the edge of what was possible in animation as a medium. Techniques that were being developed at the same time they were being used, that represent the show's production team pushing the capabilities of the medium in ways that were not yet standard practice anywhere in the industry. These techniques were used in the service of specific visual effects, specific ways of creating specific horror atmospheres that could not be achieved through conventional animation. And they were used in ways that were deliberately understated, integrated into the visual experience of the segments without calling attention to themselves, without flagging the technical achievement as something the audience should appreciate. The technical innovation was invisible because the goal was not to display innovation but to create a specific effect. The method was a means to an end, and the end was what mattered. Looking back at those segments now, with the context of knowing what was technically standard at the time, the accomplishment is visible in a way it was not when the episodes first aired. The horror segments that feel effortlessly effective, that create their atmosphere without apparent strain, are often the ones that were technically the most difficult to produce. The invisibility of the effort is itself the evidence of its quality. The Treehouse of Horror episodes have always been treated as a separate category within The Simpsons, as fun departures from the normal season that can be appreciated independently of their context within the show's history. But they are not separate at all. They are the same show, operating in a different register, allowed different freedoms, permitted different honesty. They are Springfield After Dark, the version of the town that looks directly at the things the normal season looks away from. And hidden inside that version, in the backgrounds and the audio and the structure of the segments, are things that the normal season could never contain. Things that are still there, waiting in the dark where they were left. Number. Section 14. The writing room jokes that made it past the table. There is a specific category of joke in The Simpsons that has a particular origin and a particular flavor that distinguishes it from the jokes that were planned and constructed through the normal process. These are the writing room jokes, the moments when someone in the room said something and the room laughed, and then someone else said, "Let us put that in the episode." The jokes that started as off-the-cuff remarks, as private shared references between people who had been in a room together for a long time, and who had developed the kind of shorthand that forms between people who spend a lot of time thinking about the same things. These jokes are usually identifiable by a quality of density that is different from the show's normal density. The show's regular jokes are constructed. They are the product of a process that starts with an idea and runs it through multiple drafts and multiple rounds of notes until it is working at the level the show requires. These jokes feel different. They feel like something found rather than something made. Like a joke that was always there in the material, waiting to be noticed, and that someone happened to notice and was surprised by. They tend to be briefer than the show's regular comedy beats. They tend to require more specific knowledge to appreciate, because they were made by specific people who shared specific knowledge and who calibrated the joke to their own understanding rather than to a general audience. And they tend to appear in the background or in the margins of scenes rather than in the foreground, because the jokes that are too specific for the foreground get pushed to the edges, into the spaces where their specificity will be less likely to alienate viewers who do not share the knowledge they require. The writing room of The Simpsons at its peak was a specific community with specific enthusiasms. A community of people who were all smart, all funny, all obsessive about specific things in specific ways, who had all read certain books, seen certain films, thought about certain problems, who had all developed opinions about those books and films and problems that were the product of years of engagement rather than passing familiarity, and who had all, as a result of spending years in a room together, developed a collective relationship to those enthusiasms that was different from any individual's relationship to them. The jokes that came from that collective relationship are the show's most private moments, the moments when it was being most fully itself, when it was not performing for an audience but simply expressing what the people in the room were actually like. And those moments are hidden in the backgrounds and margins of episodes because they were too specific, too interior, too much the product of a particular community's private life to belong in the foreground of a show designed for a general audience. Finding them requires knowing the writing room's enthusiasms, which requires reading the many interviews and commentaries the show's writers have given over the years, which requires a level of archival engagement that most viewers never undertake. But the interviews are out there, and the enthusiasms they document are genuine, and once you know what the people in the writing room were interested in, you start finding it in places you had previously passed over. A reference to a specific passage in a specific academic paper about linguistics that appeared in slightly disguised form in the background of a Season 6 episode. A visual joke that required understanding a specific debate in the history of philosophy of science to fully appreciate, placed in the background of a Season 7 classroom scene. A musical reference so specific that it was visible only to people who had studied a very specific period of American popular music in significant depth, placed in the audio of a Season 8 crowd scene. These are not reference jokes in the normal sense. They are not the show saying, "Look at this thing we all know." They are the show saying, "Look at this thing we know that you might not know, but we wanted to put it in the world anyway." They are the show expressing its enthusiasms rather than deploying them for comic effect. And that distinction, subtle as it is, produces a different quality of hidden content. Content that is not trying to make you laugh. Content that is simply trying to be honest about what the people who made the show found interesting. Content that is, in the most fundamental sense, a portrait of a community. The writing room jokes that made it past the table are the show's most intimate self-portraits. They are the version of the show that is visible only when you know enough about the people who made it to recognize themselves in what they made. And they are everywhere, once you know where to look. In every season, in every episode, in the backgrounds and the margins and the edges of frames that the show never expected anyone to examine. The writing room left itself in the show, the way people always leave themselves in the things they spend years making. And the show is the richer for it, even the parts of it that almost no one will ever find. Number. Section 15. The locations that are real and the joke nobody has made about them. Springfield is set nowhere and everywhere. This is the well-established intentional ambiguity of the show's geography. Matt Groening named it after Springfield, Oregon, but the show has spent 36 years contradicting that and every other geographic anchor anyone has tried to give it. Springfield borders multiple states simultaneously. It has both mountains and a coastline. Its weather is whatever the episode needs it to be. This is all well known and extensively discussed. What is less known is that specific buildings, specific streets, Specific interior spaces within Springfield are based, with considerable fidelity, on real places that actually exist. Not real places in Springfield, Oregon, not real places that the show has ever acknowledged as sources, but real places in the cities and towns where the show's writers and designers grew up and worked and lived, places that were significant enough to someone on the production team to be worth recreating an animation and placing in the background of a fictional city. The identification of these real places requires the kind of local knowledge that is not widely distributed. It requires knowing a specific neighborhood in a specific city well enough to recognize its distinctive architecture, its specific spatial relationships, its particular quality of light and proportion. This is knowledge that belongs, by definition, to the people who grew up there or who have spent enough time there to have internalized its geography. For those people, the discovery of their specific neighborhood or their specific street or their specific building in the background of a Simpsons episode is one of the most disorienting and delightful experiences the show can provide. It is the experience of finding your world inside someone else's world, of discovering that something you thought was private and specific to your experience is actually present in a piece of cultural fabric that belongs to everyone, of realizing that someone who made the show knew the same place you know and cared enough about it to put it in Springfield. For everyone else, the real place backgrounds are simply backgrounds. They look like well-crafted environments that have the quality of real places because the people who designed them cared about getting environments right, which is also true. The environments in Springfield's best seasons have a quality of reality that exceeds what pure invention usually achieves, because they are not pure invention. They are memories of real places, filtered through animation, contributing their specific spatial character to a fictional world. The most systematic of these real place references is Springfield's downtown. The commercial district that appears in crowd scenes and establishing shots across the show's history is a composite of real American downtowns from specific eras. The specific combination of storefront types, building proportions, street furniture, and spatial relationships that characterizes Springfield's downtown corresponds to specific aspects of specific real American commercial streets from specific decades. Not one real street, but pieces of many real streets, assembled into a fictional street that feels real precisely because each piece of it was drawn from reality. Identifying the sources of specific pieces of Springfield's downtown requires having seen those real streets in their original form, which means being old enough or obsessive enough about architectural history to have the reference points. But the sources are identifiable. They are traceable through the specific combination of design elements that characterizes each section of Springfield's commercial landscape, elements that are specific enough to belong to specific eras and specific regional traditions of American commercial architecture. There is a category of real place reference that is even more specific and even more personal. These are the interiors, the specific rooms and spaces that appear in the show's backgrounds that correspond to specific real interiors from the lives of the people who made the show. Specific restaurants, specific bars, specific living rooms, specific offices, places where specific conversations happened, where specific work was done, where specific things occurred that were important enough to be worth preserving in animation. A bar that appears in the background of a crowd scene in a Season 5 episode has the specific proportions and the specific arrangement of furniture that characterized a specific real bar in a specific American city at a specific point in time. A bar that was, at the point of the episode's production, frequented by people who worked on the show. The bar is not named. It is not identified. It appears in the background for a few seconds and then disappears. But it is there, in Springfield, preserved in animation, available to anyone who happened to know that bar in that city during that period of the show's production. These personal interior references are the most intimate category of real place content in the show, because they are the most specific to individual experiences. The bar reference is not for everyone who has ever been to any bar. It is for the specific people who were in that specific bar during the time when the episode was being made. Everyone else sees a well-designed background environment that has the quality of reality because it is drawn from reality. The specific people it is for see something else. They see a memory made permanent. Now let us think about what this practice means for the experience of watching the show across time. The real places embedded in Springfield's backgrounds are, in most cases, places that have changed since the show embedded them. Real cities change. Real streets change. Bars close. Buildings are demolished. Neighborhoods are redeveloped. The specific spatial character of real places is altered by the passage of time and the processes of economic change and urban development that alter all real places. But Springfield does not change in those ways. Springfield is frozen, as we have discussed, and the real places embedded in Springfield's backgrounds are frozen with it. A bar that closed in 1997 is still open in Springfield. A building that was demolished in 2003 is still standing in Springfield. A street that no longer looks the way it looked is preserved, in animation, in the backgrounds of episodes made when it still looked that way. Springfield is, in this sense, an unintentional archive. An archive not of fictional history, but of real history. The real places embedded in its backgrounds are the real places as they existed at specific moments in the past, preserved against the changes that have since transformed or destroyed the originals. The archive is private, accessible only to people who knew the originals well enough to recognize them, but it is there. The show has been collecting real places for 36 years, and many of those places exist now only inside it. Number, Section 16. The moments the show told the truth about itself. There are moments distributed across the full run of The Simpsons in which the show steps outside its own fictional frame, however briefly, and says something true. Not true in the way that all good fiction is true. Not true in the way that a well-observed human behavior is true, even when it is presented through the medium of a cartoon family. True in a more specific and more unusual sense. Moments when the show appears to be making a genuine acknowledgement of something about its own nature or its own situation that the fictional frame would normally prevent. These moments are difficult to identify because they tend to be brief, and they tend to be embedded in contexts where they read most naturally as jokes. The show is always doing at least two things simultaneously, telling its story and commenting on its story. This is the condition of sophisticated comedy, but in these specific moments, the commentary moves into a register that feels less like wit and more like honesty, less like the show playing with its own conventions, and more like the show seeing itself clearly. The clearest examples involve the show's relationship to time and aging, topics that are structurally unavoidable given the show's premise, but that the floating timeline convention normally allows the show to avoid confronting directly. In certain episodes across the show's middle and later seasons, individual scenes contain brief moments in which a character says or does something that, in the context of the scene, reads as a joke about the character's situation, but that, in the context of the show's history, reads as something more honest than a joke. A moment in which Homer, confronted with evidence of how much time has passed in the real world, looks genuinely confused. Not comedically confused, in the exaggerated cartoon manner that the show uses for Homer's characteristic bafflement, but quietly confused, in a way that reads as more than performance. A moment in which the show's own impossibility seems to register on the face of one of its characters. These moments are vanishingly brief. They are generally followed immediately by a joke that restores the normal register of the scene and sends the viewer forward into the next beat without time to reflect on what just happened. They are designed, or at least structured, to prevent the audience from dwelling on them. But they are there. And they are recognizable, once you have seen enough of the show to know what they feel like, as different from the surrounding material in a specific and consistent way. There is a related category of truthful moment that involves the show's relationship to its own quality. Across its long run, The Simpsons has gone through periods of different levels of creative energy, and the people making it have not always been unaware of those differences. There are moments in episodes from the show's later seasons in which the material itself seems to acknowledge, in a specific and structured way, that something about the earlier version of the show was different from the current version. Moments that read, if you are attending to them, as the show reflecting on its own history with a kind of honesty that the formal requirements of entertainment normally prevent. These are not the self-referential jokes that the show has always made about its own format and conventions. Those are deliberate and comfortable, the show playing with the audience's awareness of what the show is. The moments we are talking about are different. They are uncomfortable, briefly. They are the sound of the show being honest with itself in a moment when the requirements of entertainment have loosened enough for honesty to be possible. The moments are not enough to build a thesis on. They are too few and too brief and too easily read as simple jokes rather than as genuine self-reflection. But they are there, and they constitute a kind of private communication between the show and the most attentive segment of its audience. The viewers who have been watching long enough to feel the difference between the show at its peak and the show at other points in its history, and who recognize, in these brief moments, that the people making the show have sometimes felt that difference too. There is a final category of truthful moment that may be the most extraordinary of all, because it involves the show apparently acknowledging the fan theories about its own nature. Across the show's later seasons, there are specific episodes that contain specific moments that seem to engage with specific fan interpretations of the show's world and its history. Moments that acknowledge, however briefly and obliquely, the readings that decades of devoted audience attention have produced. These are not the explicit acknowledgments, the deliberate fake-outs like the season 34 deleted scene that appeared to confirm the Homer coma theory before revealing itself as a planted hoax. Those are the show engaging with its own mythology in a deliberate, curated way. The moments we are talking about are subtler and stranger, moments in which the dialogue or the visual choices in a scene seem to register the existence of a specific fan interpretation without explicitly confirming or denying it. Moments that feel like the show winking at a specific segment of its audience, the segment that has been reading the show's history in a specific way, acknowledging that it knows what they see in it. Whether these moments are deliberate signals embedded by writers who were aware of specific fan interpretations, or coincidences that the pattern-seeking tendencies of a devoted audience have elevated into apparent significance, is impossible to determine with certainty. The show has never confirmed this category of hidden content, and the writers who would know whether specific moments were intentional have generally declined to address specific questions about their intentions. But the moments are there, and they fit the pattern of everything else we have been discussing for hours. The pattern of a show that built things into its backgrounds and margins and edges that were not there for everyone, but that were there for specific people with specific knowledge and specific patience. The pattern of a show that believed in the intelligence and the devotion of the portion of its audience that brought those qualities to the experience of watching it. The truthful moments are the show's most direct communication with the most attentive part of its audience. They are the show saying, across the distance that separates fiction from reality and production from reception, that it knows what it is, that it has always known, and that it chose to be that anyway. Springfield will always contain more than anyone has found. The show will always contain more than anyone has fully understood, not because it was built to be inexhaustible, but because it was built by people who cared about what they were building in a way that produces inexhaustibility as a side effect. Who put things in the backgrounds because the backgrounds deserve to be populated? Who put things in the margins because the margins deserve to contain something? Who put things in places no one was supposed to look because the world deserved to be built all the way through? The hidden content of The Simpsons is not a puzzle to be solved. It is not a code to be cracked or a mystery to be resolved. It is the record of a community of people who loved what they were making and expressed that love in the only way available to them, by making it well, all the way through, including the parts that no one was going to see. Those parts are there. They have always been there. They will always be there. Patient in the way that things are patient when they know that the right person will eventually come along. Patient in the way that Springfield has always been patient. It will be here when you come back. It always is. That is the whole point. Number. Section 17. The predictions nobody talks about. The Simpsons predicted the future. This is the most famous claim made about the show, and it is also the most misunderstood one. The predictions that get discussed are the spectacular ones. The Donald Trump presidency, the smartwatch, the tablet computer, the Higgs boson mass, the FIFA corruption scandal, autocorrect errors, virtual reality, the Tiger King phenomenon. These are real. These are documented. These are astonishing in ways that feel almost supernatural when you line them up. But these are not the most interesting predictions. They are not the predictions that reveal the most about what the show was doing and how it was doing it. The predictions that are most revealing are the ones nobody talks about, the ones that are too small to generate headlines, the ones that came true quietly and without anyone noticing that they had come true. Let us understand first what kind of predictive power the show actually had, because the word prediction suggests something it was not. The Simpsons did not have access to the future. Its writers were not clairvoyant. What they had was something more interesting and more useful than clairvoyance. They had an extraordinarily sophisticated model of the present, and the future, in most cases, is the present extrapolated forward along the lines of its own internal logic. The show was staffed by people who understood systems, who understood technology, economics, politics, culture, human behavior, institutional dynamics, Who could look at a present-day situation and trace its likely trajectories forward with a precision that most people could not match? When the show appears to have predicted the future, what it usually did was follow the internal logic of the present further than most observers were willing to follow it, and turn that extrapolation into a joke. And then the future caught up with the joke. Consider the specific category of prediction that involves technology. The show's track record on technology is extraordinary, not because the writers had access to secret information about what Apple or Google or Samsung was developing, but because they understood what technology was for and where the demand for technology was coming from. They understood that human beings want certain things, that technology serves those wants, that the specific technologies that get developed are the ones that most efficiently serve the strongest wants, and that the wants do not change as quickly as the technologies that serve them do. Understanding this is understanding enough to make a lot of predictions. If you know what people want, and you understand the principle that technology evolves towards serving wants more efficiently, you can sketch the general outline of future technology with reasonable accuracy. The specific implementation details will be wrong, the timing will be off, but the general direction of the prediction will be right more often than not. The Simpsons writers understood this, and they used it, and the results have been extraordinary across the show's history. But what is interesting for our purposes is not the famous predictions. The famous predictions have been cataloged. The interesting ones are the ones about small things, about the texture of daily life, about the specific ways that people relate to each other and to the systems they live within, about the quiet and particular ways that the world changes around people who are not paying attention to it changing. There is an episode from the middle seasons in which a character uses a device that provides navigation instructions in the form of spoken voice directions. This was produced during a period when GPS navigation was a military and specialized commercial technology, years before it became available in consumer devices, and more years before it became the standard way that people navigate in cars. The device in the episode is treated as a joke, specifically as a joke about over-reliance on technology, about the tendency to substitute the authority of a machine for one's own judgment. The joke is about the technology's fallibility. What the episode actually predicted was not just the technology but the specific social behavior around the technology, the specific relationship between drivers and GPS devices that became characteristic of the experience of driving with GPS once it became widely available. The technology arrived and people related to it in exactly the way the show had imagined they would, years before the technology existed to produce that relationship. This is a different kind of prediction than the headline-generating ones. It is a prediction not of a specific invention but of a specific human behavior around a technology that did not yet exist. To make this prediction, you do not need to know what technologies are being developed in corporate research laboratories. You need to understand people well enough to know how they will behave in the presence of a certain kind of authority, a certain kind of perceived infallibility, a certain kind of external voice telling them what to do and where to go. The Simpsons understood people in this way. It understood them well enough to anticipate how they would behave in situations that had not yet arisen, with technologies that had not yet been invented, in social contexts that did not yet exist. And it anticipated these things not through any special access to information, but through the fundamental clarity of its observation about human nature. There is a category of prediction that is even less discussed because it requires even more specific knowledge to recognize. These are the predictions about specific cultural and institutional developments, about the specific ways that American cultural and political life would evolve that turned out to be correct in ways that were not spectacular enough to generate the headline, "Simpsons predicted it again," but that were, when you look back at them now, quite remarkable. An episode from the late 1990s depicts the dynamics of a specific kind of cable news broadcast in ways that accurately anticipated the format and the specific rhetorical choices of a kind of political television that did not exist yet in the form the episode depicted. The episode is played as satire, as comedy, as an exaggerated depiction of something that already existed in embryonic form. But the specific characteristics it attributes to the broadcast, its pacing, its use of emotional manipulation, its specific relationship to its audience's fears and grievances, anticipate the mature form of the medium years before that mature form developed. Someone watching cable news in its later, fully developed form, and then watching this episode again, would recognize, with uncanny precision, the specific dynamics that the show had anticipated. Not the content of the news, not the specific political affiliations, the specific formal and rhetorical properties of a medium that would grow significantly in cultural importance in the years after the episode aired. The predictions nobody talks about are the predictions about how things feel, not just about what technologies will exist or what events will happen, but about the specific texture of experience that those technologies and events will produce. The Simpsons was extraordinarily good at predicting how things would feel, because it was extraordinarily good at understanding how things feel in the first place, which is a form of understanding that translates forward in time more reliably than most other forms of understanding. When the show depicted the experience of being constantly reachable by communication technology, years before such constant reachability became the normal condition of most people's lives, it was not predicting a specific technology. It was predicting the feeling of that technology, the specific quality of social anxiety that comes from being always available, always potentially interrupted, always in contact with networks of obligation and expectation that have no clear boundaries. The show predicted that feeling in episodes that used the plot device of the show's era's communication technology to explore it. And the feeling was accurate. The future arrived and confirmed the show's understanding of it. The most interesting thing about The Simpsons' predictive record is not that the show was right so many times. It is what it reveals about the show's fundamental understanding of the world. The predictions are evidence of something more important than prescience. They are evidence of a quality of observation, a depth of understanding about how human beings and the systems they build actually work that made the future legible from the present in ways it is not legible to most observers. The show saw clearly, and seeing clearly is, in the end, the only predictive power that actually works. Number. Section 18. The hidden political commentary in specific seasons. The Simpsons is a political show. This is not controversial, and it is not hidden. The show has been explicitly and persistently political for its entire run, and its politics have been the subject of substantial discussion and analysis from scholars, journalists, and fans. But the show's explicit politics are not what this section is about. The explicit politics are visible. The satire of Mr. Burns as capitalist villain, the critique of institutional America in the treatment of the Springfield government and school system, the pointed humor directed at specific political figures, the consistently skeptical treatment of authority in all its forms, these are apparent and acknowledged. What is hidden is different and more interesting. The hidden political commentary in The Simpsons operates not at the level of explicit satire, but at the level of embedded perspective, of the specific choices made in the construction of the show's world that carry political meaning without ever being labeled as political. The choices that built into Springfield a specific way of understanding American life, a specific model of how power works and how people relate to it, that operates below the level of the show's explicit political jokes, and that shapes the viewer's experience in ways that are almost impossible to consciously identify. This is the most sophisticated form of political art. Not argument, but construction. Not telling the viewer what to think, but building a world in which certain things become visible that are invisible in other constructions of the world. Building Springfield in such a way that the viewer, simply by spending time in it, develops a certain kind of understanding about how the world works. The most fundamental level of this hidden political construction is the show's treatment of class. Springfield is a working-class American city. This is established in its commercial landscape, its residential geography, its institutional life. The specific economic anxieties that drive its characters' behavior, the specific ways that money and its absence shape the possibilities available to its residents. The show never describes Springfield as working class. It never uses that language, never explicitly frames the Simpson family's economic position as a class position in the formal sociological sense. It just builds a world in which the economic reality of working-class American life is simply the texture of everyday existence. This is politically significant in ways that are much more powerful than explicit class consciousness rhetoric would be. Rhetoric about class is legible as political and can be dismissed as such. The construction of a world in which class is simply what life is like, simply the fabric of ordinary existence, creates an understanding that operates below the level of political defensiveness. The viewer absorbs it without registering that they are absorbing it, and what they absorb is a specific, accurate, and illuminating understanding of how economic position shapes the texture of daily life in America. The hidden political commentary in specific seasons of the show is most visible when you track specific thematic threads across multiple episodes in a single production period. Each individual episode is a self-contained story with its own specific satirical targets and its own specific comedic logic. But across a season, across the episodes produced during the same period by the same writers in the same cultural moment, patterns emerge that are not visible in any individual episode. The seasons produced during periods of significant economic anxiety in American public life contain, distributed across their individual episodes, a sustained engagement with the specific mechanisms of that anxiety, not a direct representation, not documentary realism, but a consistent attention to the specific ways that economic pressure shapes the behavior of people who are subject to it, the ways it produces specific emotional textures, specific social dynamics, specific patterns of aspiration and disappointment. Across a season, this attention adds up to something that is more politically specific than any individual episode, and that represents a sustained observation about what American economic life was actually like during the period the show was produced. The same pattern is visible across the show's treatment of institutional power. In any individual episode, the institutions that appear, the school, the government, the church, the hospital, the workplace, are satirical objects. They are depicted with exaggeration, their failings made comic, their specific forms of dysfunction played for laughs. But across multiple seasons of consistently attentive depiction, these institutions accumulate a portrait that is more honest than satire alone usually manages to be. A portrait not of institutions as they appear to be, but of institutions as they actually function, with their specific tendencies towards self-preservation, their specific relationships to the people they nominally serve, their specific ways of distributing power and consequence. The political education embedded in The Simpsons at its best is not an education in political ideology. It is an education in political reality, in the specific ways that power operates in the specific kinds of institutions that most American people actually encounter in their daily lives. An education conducted not through argument but through the sustained, detailed, attentive construction of a world in which these things are simply visible. There is a dimension of the show's hidden political commentary that is less about what it depicts and more about what it refuses to depict. The specific absences in Springfield's world are as politically significant as the presences, the things that are not shown, the solutions that are never proposed, the alternatives that the show's world never makes available to its characters. These absences encode a specific understanding of American life and its limits. Springfield's residents are capable of solidarity. They are capable of collective action. The show depicts these things on occasion, with real warmth and real appreciation of their value. But the things that threaten Springfield, the concentrated power, the institutional dysfunction, the economic pressures, the systemic forces that shape its residents' lives without those residents having any meaningful input into them, these things are never resolved by solidarity or collective action in the show's world. They are endured. They are satirized. They are survived with humor and community and the specific pleasures of ordinary life in ordinary circumstances. This is a political position. It is not a loudly argued position. It is a position embedded in the structure of the world the show builds, in the specific things that are possible in that world and the specific things that are not. And it is a position that the show maintains consistently across its long history, through many different writing staffs and many different creative periods, because it reflects something genuine about the understanding of American life that is at the show's core. The hidden political commentary of The Simpsons is the show's most durable and most consequential contribution to American culture. More durable than any individual joke, more consequential than any individual satire. It is embedded in the DNA of the world the show built, available to everyone who inhabits that world, and visible in full only to people who have spent enough time in it to understand what it is actually saying underneath everything it appears to be saying. Number. Section 918. The impossible geography of Springfield. Springfield occupies a unique position in the geography of American fiction. It is the most specific imaginary city in the history of American storytelling. It has neighborhoods, zoning, geography, a downtown and an uptown, a waterfront and an industrial district, a wealthy enclave and a struggling working-class quarter. It has a history visible in the layered architecture of its buildings. It has a civic life, a political structure, a complex web of institutional relationships. It is, in every sense that matters for the experience of inhabiting it as a viewer, a real city. And it is also a city that cannot exist. Not just in the sense that Springfield is fictional, but in the more interesting sense that the Springfield visible across the show's run contradicts itself so comprehensively and so specifically that no single coherent city could contain all of its geography. Springfield has been shown to have mountains to the north and a coast to the south, a desert to the east and a river to the west, a position in a state that borders 4 different states depending on which episode you are watching. It has been shown to be a short drive from Capital City, and from Shelbyville, and from a nuclear power plant, and from the ocean, and from the kind of mountainous wilderness where you can get seriously lost. The show's geography, accumulated across 788 episodes, describes not one city but many, overlapping and contradicting each other, combined into a single name and a single set of characters. This is usually discussed as a continuity problem, as the kind of error that accumulates in a long-running episodic show that never established a clear geographic canon. And that is certainly part of what it is. But it is also something more interesting, and something more deliberately managed, than a simple continuity error. The impossible geography of Springfield is the spatial equivalent of the show's impossible timeline. The show's characters do not age across its run, not in any linear way. The city they inhabit does not have a consistent geography across its run. Both impossibilities serve the same purpose. They allow Springfield to be wherever the story needs it to be, whenever the story needs it to be there. The geography is impossible because the story is not trying to be geographically consistent. It is trying to be emotionally and thematically consistent. And it achieves that consistency in a city that changes its location every time it changes its story. But this explanation, while correct, misses the more interesting fact. The impossible geography of Springfield is not randomly impossible. The contradictions in Springfield's geography are not arbitrary. They cluster around specific kinds of episodes and specific kinds of stories in ways that suggest, if not a fully intentional system, at least a tendency in the show's geographic imagination. The episodes in which Springfield is near the ocean, in which the ocean is accessible and present in the character's experience, tend to be episodes about escape and possibility, about the feeling of an elsewhere, of a world beyond the specific constraints of the specific life the characters inhabit. The ocean in Springfield exists not as a geographic fact but as an emotional one. It appears when the story needs the emotional weight of the ocean, the feeling of vast space and freedom, and the possibility of departure. The episodes in which Springfield is surrounded by wilderness, in which forests and mountains press against its edges, tend to be episodes about isolation and containment, about the specific feeling of being enclosed, of being subject to forces larger than yourself, of being in a world whose scale is indifferent to your individual existence. The wilderness exists as an emotional correlative to those feelings. The episodes in which Springfield is near other cities, near the mechanisms of power and culture and commerce that the show uses Capital City to represent, tend to be episodes about aspiration and inadequacy, about the distance between Springfield's residents and the centers of power and culture that they are aware of but cannot quite reach. Springfield's geography is emotionally consistent even when it is geographically impossible. It is a city that positions itself differently relative to the emotional needs of each story it tells. And this is, when you understand it, a more sophisticated form of world-building than simple geographic consistency would allow. A consistent geography would fix Springfield in a single emotional position relative to its surrounding world. An impossible geography allows it to be in a different emotional position for each story, to be distant or close, enclosed or open, connected or isolated, depending on what the story needs. The geography of Springfield is not a map, it is a mood, and moods, unlike maps, can be contradictory and multiple and still be true. Consider also the specific geography of the Simpson house. Because it is the most frequently depicted space in the show's history, and because its geography is perhaps the most thoroughly impossible of any space in the show. The Simpson house has been depicted with multiple different internal configurations across its long run. The position of rooms relative to each other changes between episodes. The number of windows in specific rooms changes. The view from specific windows changes to depict different neighboring environments depending on the needs of the scene. The staircase changes its relationship to the front door. The basement appears and disappears. The layout of the kitchen changes. But certain things remain constant. Homer's chair in the living room, the position of the television, the table in the kitchen where the family eats, the front door. These constants, maintained across the impossible geography of the surrounding space, create a sense of the house that transcends its physical layout. You know the house. You know where things are in it. Not in the floor plan sense, but in the emotional sense. You know the feeling of each space. And that feeling is consistent even when the physical facts are not. The Simpson house is a feeling. Like Springfield itself, like American domestic life more broadly, it is constituted more by habitual emotional associations than by fixed physical facts. You know you are home not because you have mapped the floor plan, but because you recognize the feeling of the specific spaces, the specific furniture, the specific arrangement of objects that have become familiar through long association. The show captures this truth about domestic experience by depicting the house in ways that are emotionally consistent but geometrically impossible. It is, in this sense, a more accurate representation of home than a precisely mapped floor plan could ever be. Number. Section 20. The recurring numbers and what they mean. Numbers mean things. In The Simpsons, numbers mean more specific things than numbers usually mean in television, because the show's writers were, in a significant proportion, people who had been trained to think about what numbers mean and to pay attention to the specific content of numerical claims. This manifests in many ways across the show's history. The precision standard we discussed in the mathematics section is one manifestation. The embedded equations are another. But there is a third and less discussed category of numerical hidden content that operates across the full run of the show. The recurring numbers, the specific numbers that appear again and again across episodes and seasons in contexts that vary widely but that create, through their repetition, a pattern of meaning. Every long-running show has recurring elements that its fans identify and catalog. Character quirks, running jokes, specific phrases that recur with different inflections across different situations. The Simpsons is no different in having these. But the recurring numbers in the show are different from most recurring elements because their repetition is not primarily comedic. They do not recur the way running jokes recur, to be recognized and appreciated as callbacks. They recur in a way that feels more like they are doing something, like they are accumulating a significance that is not fully legible in any single instance but that becomes clearer as the instances multiply. The number that has attracted the most attention among fans who track this kind of thing is the number 39. It appears across the show's history in a remarkable variety of contexts. Ages of characters who are never given a specific age elsewhere in the show, and who are 39 in the episode that reveals their age. Numbers of items in lists that are given specific quantities. Prices of specific goods or services. Distances between locations. Scores in games and competitions. Dates that are expressed numerically rather than verbally. The contexts are too varied and the repetition too consistent to be accidental. Someone, at some point in the show's history, made the number 39 a recurring element, and then it was maintained, consciously or unconsciously, by the writing staff across many seasons of production. The maintenance might reflect a single individual's sustained decision. It might reflect a cultural norm in the writing room that was never formally articulated. It might reflect the specific way that writers, when choosing a number that needs to be arbitrary, draw from their internalized sense of what a plausible number for a given context is, and that sense, shaped by years of working in the same room, might produce consistent choices that look intentional without being deliberately coordinated. But the number is there, recurring, in contexts that span the show's full history. And it is there often enough, and in specific enough contexts, to make you wonder what it means, or whether it means anything, or whether the question of whether it means anything is itself the wrong question. There are other recurring numbers in the show, though none as consistent as 39. Certain dollar amounts recur across episodes set in very different economic contexts, in ways that suggest either a shared intuitive sense among the writers about what a plausible amount of money in a given context looks like, or a more deliberate use of specific numbers to create an implicit sense that Springfield's economy has a consistent internal logic. Certain durations recur in descriptions of how long things take, how long things have been happening, how long characters have been doing or not doing specific things. Certain distances recur in descriptions of how far Springfield is from various things. These recurring numbers create, across the full run of the show, a subliminal impression of quantitative consistency that is at odds with Springfield's obvious geographic and temporal impossibility. The city contradicts itself in space and time, but maintains a certain numerical consistency that makes it feel, paradoxically, real. As if the numbers are truer than the geography, as if the specific quantitative facts about the city have a stability that its physical layout does not. This is another form of the show's construction of a world that is emotionally and thematically consistent, even when it is physically inconsistent. The recurring numbers are part of the world's internal logic, a logic that operates below the level of explicit geography or timeline, at the level of the specific details that accumulate across episodes to create a feeling of familiarity and specificity that is more powerful, for most viewers, than any physical description could be. Numbers in The Simpsons say true things even when they are saying impossible things. They are part of the show's truth, which is a truth not about where Springfield is located, or how old its residents are, or how much things cost in its economy. It is a truth about the texture of daily life in a specific kind of American city, and that texture is expressed in the numerical fabric of the show as much as in its visual and narrative fabric. Pay attention to the numbers. They are telling you something. They are always telling you something, even when you cannot quite hear what it is. Number Section 21. The animators' private jokes about each other. Animation studios are communities. Small, intensive communities of people who spend their working lives in proximity to each other, doing the same work, dealing with the same pressures, developing the specific kind of social intimacy that forms in creative workplaces where the work itself is demanding and the relationships it produces are correspondingly intense. Every creative community develops a private language, in-jokes that are legible only to the community itself, references that require shared knowledge of specific events, specific conversations, specific moments in the community's internal life, a humor that is calibrated to the specific sensibilities of the specific people who comprise the community rather than to any outside audience. In animation studios, this private language has a direct path into the work. The animators are putting marks on the frames. The frames go into the show. And sometimes, not often, but with enough regularity to constitute a pattern, the marks they put on the frames include elements of the private language, elements that will be legible to people in the studio and invisible to everyone outside it. The Simpsons has been produced by many different animation studios across its long run, and the private language of those studios has left its marks in the show's frames in ways that are difficult to identify without access to the internal culture of the studios themselves. But some of these marks are findable, because some of the people who worked in those studios have talked about them in interviews and commentary tracks and online discussions over the years since the work was done. The most common category of animator private joke embedded in the show is the category of visual detail that references a specific person or event in the studio's social life. A background character whose visual design is recognizably a caricature of a specific coworker, placed in the background of a scene as a private acknowledgement of that coworker's existence. A visual element in a specific scene that recreates a specific moment or location from the studio's daily life, visible to people who shared that life and invisible to everyone else. A specific visual joke that requires knowing a specific conversation or a specific running argument among the studio's staff to understand, placed in the background for the people who were in the room when the conversation happened. These are the most intimate and the most invisible form of hidden content in the show, because they require knowledge that was never made public and that lived only in the specific social world of a specific creative community at a specific moment. Most of that knowledge is lost now. The studios have changed, the people have moved on, the specific social world that produced these jokes no longer exists in the same form. But the jokes are still in the frames, and some of them are findable by careful attention to the kind of visual anomalies that distinguish deliberate inside references from ordinary background detail. The frame that holds a crowd scene in the background of a Season 4 episode, examined carefully, contains 3 figures in a specific area of the frame, whose visual designs are subtly different from the surrounding crowd figures, in ways that suggest individual characterization rather than generic crowd population. They are doing something specific, interacting in a specific way, positioned in a way that suggests they are characters in a scene rather than atmosphere in a crowd. They are someone's private joke about someone, placed in the background for the studio community and lost to everyone else. There is a related category of animator private joke that is slightly less personal and slightly more findable. These are the visual references to specific works of animation, specific films or shorts or sequences that have special significance within the culture of professional animators. References that signal membership in a community of practice, that say to other animators who might watch the finished frame, this was made by someone who knows this work and cares about it. In the backgrounds of Simpsons episodes across its history, there are visual quotations from the tradition of animation art that are specific enough to be identifiable by anyone who knows the tradition, but that pass entirely without notice for viewers who do not. A compositional choice that recreates a specific shot from a specific classic animated short. A character design that quotes, in simplified form, a specific visual approach associated with a specific era of animation production. A background environment that incorporates specific visual principles associated with a specific national tradition of animation. These references are love letters between animators, written in the margins of a show that millions of people watch. They are the professional community expressing its shared history and its shared enthusiasms in the only way available to it, through the work itself, in the parts of the work that most viewers never examine. They are still there, those love letters, in the backgrounds of specific episodes, in the margins of specific scenes, written in a language that is specific to the people who made them, available to anyone who has learned enough of that language to read them, waiting as everything in Springfield waits for the right pair of eyes to find them. Number section 22. The last things to find. We are near the end now. Not the end of Springfield, which has no end. Not the end of what is hidden in Springfield, which also has no end. But the end of this particular journey through the invisible parts of the show, this particular attempt to document what is there for anyone patient enough to look. The last things to find in Springfield are not the most hidden. They are not buried in the deepest layers of the production, visible only to people with specialized equipment or specialized knowledge. They are hidden in plain sight, in the most ordinary seeming elements of the show's production, in places so familiar that no one thinks to look at them carefully. Hidden in the opening sequence that every viewer has watched hundreds of times, and that still, after hundreds of watchings, contains things that most viewers have never noticed. Look at the clouds above Springfield at the very beginning of the opening sequence. The clouds have shapes. Most of them have shapes that are clearly just clouds, the rounded, variable shapes that real clouds have. But several specific clouds in the establishing shot of Springfield, the clouds that appear in the same position in the opening sequence in every episode, have shapes that are not just cloud shapes. They are shapes that are recognizable as other things to anyone who is looking at them as shapes rather than as clouds. Shapes that correspond to specific objects or forms that have significance within the show's world. The sky above Springfield has always been telling you something about the city below it, something encoded in the shapes of clouds that everyone sees and no one examines. Look at the way the camera moves in the opening sequence, because it is not the same in every episode. The broad structure is the same. The camera establishes Springfield, follows the family's convergence toward the house, follows the couch gag. But the specific angle of approach, the specific framing of specific moments in the sequence, varies in ways that are subtle enough to go unnoticed but consistent enough to be deliberate. The opening sequence has a grammar. The variations in that grammar, the moments when the camera does something slightly different from its default, tend to correspond to something in the episode that follows. The opening sequence is always the same, and it is always slightly different, and the differences are always saying something. Look at Maggie. In the moment before the opening sequence ends, when she is scanned as part of the grocery checkout and her price comes up on the register display. The price has been the same for most of the show's history, a specific number that constitutes one of the show's gentler running jokes. But the price has changed at specific moments in the show's history. Specific episodes have changed the price on Maggie's scanner to a different number, a number that is different from the standard number in a way that rewards examination. The price changes have always been deliberate. They have always meant something. And the meanings in the episodes where the price has changed have always corresponded to something in the episode itself. Maggie's price is a number. And sometimes, in specific episodes, it is a message. Look at the couch itself. Not the couch gag, not the events that happen at the couch or around it, but the couch as a physical object across the show's long history. The couch has a color, a shape, a specific pattern of wear and aging that is maintained across seasons with the same kind of hidden continuity that we have been discussing throughout this journey. The couch accumulates wear, it fades slightly in certain areas. It maintains the specific impression of being the couch that a specific family has been sitting on for a specific length of time. It is not always new. It is not always in the same state. It is a piece of furniture that has been lived with, and the evidence of that living is there in the visual texture of the object across the show's history. The couch is the most looked-at piece of furniture in television history. Hundreds of millions of people have seen it every week for 36 years, and most of them have never really looked at it. They have looked at what happens around it, at the couch gag, at the family settling into it, at the television that the family watches from it. But the couch itself, as an object, as a specific piece of furniture in a specific house belonging to a specific family, has been accumulating its quiet evidence all along, waiting for someone to look at it the way you look at a thing rather than through it. Everything in Springfield is waiting to be looked at that way. Everything has been waiting since the first episode aired and the first viewer watched and saw the show rather than seeing the world inside the show. The world inside the show has always been there, complete and carefully made and patient in the specific way that things are patient when they were built to last longer than any viewer's attention will allow. The last things to find in Springfield are the things that were never hidden, that have always been there, in the most obvious places, visible to anyone who is actually looking rather than watching. The sky and the clouds and the price on the scanner and the texture of the couch, the things that everyone has seen and almost no one has ever actually looked at, those are the things still waiting to be found. They will keep waiting. They are in no hurry. They have been there since 1989, and they will be there long after any individual viewer has finished watching. Patient in the way that Springfield is always patient. Full in the way that Springfield is always full. Ready for whoever comes next, bringing whatever attention they are capable of bringing, and finding in the invisible parts of a fictional city whatever they have the knowledge and the patience and the love for the show to find. Whatever that is, it will be there. It is always there. Wherever they were left, there they remain. Patient in the way Springfield has always been patient. Full in the way Springfield has always been full. Section 23. The things still left to find. This is where every exploration of The Simpsons eventually arrives, not at a conclusion, but at the edge of what has been found so far, looking out at the territory that has not been mapped yet. The show has been running for 36 years, 788 episodes, somewhere in the region of 17,000 minutes of finished animation, each minute containing dozens of frames, each frame containing background details that were chosen rather than invented, ambient audio that was mixed rather than generated, and the accumulated evidence of hundreds of creative decisions made by hundreds of people across decades of production. What has been found constitutes a small fraction of what is there. The fraction that happened to catch the eye of the right person at the right moment, the fraction that found its way into fan communities and archival discussions, and the kind of patient collective attention that the internet has made possible. The fraction that required the specific combination of knowledge and timing that allows a thing to be discovered rather than simply existing undiscovered. The rest is still there. There are background signs in episodes from the show's earliest seasons that have never been clearly read because the resolution of home video formats from that period made background text illegible, and the streaming masters have not always preserved the original image quality. There are crowd conversations buried in ambient audio tracks that have not yet been extracted because the specific episodes containing them have not yet attracted the attention of someone with the right equipment and the right motivation. There are real places embedded in Springfield's backgrounds that have not yet been identified because the people who knew those places and who watched the show have not yet made the connection between what they know and what they see. There are mathematical objects in Springfield's educational backgrounds that have not yet been recognized as mathematical objects because the right mathematician has not yet paused the episode at the right frame. There are film references in Springfield's visual grammar that have not yet been identified because the right film scholar has not yet watched the right episode in the right frame of mind. There are private jokes from the writing room and the animation studios embedded in 36 years of production that exist in the memories of the people who made them and nowhere else, because no one has yet asked the right question of the right person. There are structural patterns across the show's long run that exist only in the aggregate, visible only to someone who has watched every episode enough times, in enough different registers of attention, to sense the patterns that no individual episode makes visible. There are thematic echoes between episodes that have not yet been mapped because the mapping requires a kind of sustained comparative attention that is difficult to sustain across the full breadth of the show's history. There are continuity threads that run across the full span of the production whose endpoints have been documented without anyone yet connecting them to their sources. Every person who watches The Simpsons brings something different to the experience. Different knowledge, different attention, different patience, different enthusiasms. The show was built to give back to all of them. To reward the person who watches for the jokes, and the person who watches for the stories, and the person who watches for the background details, and the person who watches for the structural patterns, and the person who watches for the mathematical content, and the person who watches for the music, and the person who watches for the history, and the person who watches simply because it is comfortable and familiar, and because Springfield has been home for as long as they can remember. Whatever you bring to it, there is something there for you. Whatever you are looking for, you will find something you were not looking for first. Whatever you know, the show knows something you do not, and it is waiting to show you, in the specific patient way that things wait when they know they have time. The things still left to find are the best reason to keep watching. Not the episodes you have seen before, comfortable and familiar, settling you into the rhythms of a world you know. The things still left to find are the reason to watch again, differently, with the part of your attention that usually goes elsewhere. To look at the edges of frames instead of their centers, to listen to what is behind the dialogue instead of only to the dialogue itself, to compare what you see this time to what you saw last time, and to ask what is different, and whether the difference means something. It probably does. Someone put it there, someone who believed that the invisible parts of a world deserve as much care as the visible parts. Someone who was right about that. The things still left to find are waiting for you specifically, in the sense that they are waiting for whoever will look for them, and you are as likely to be that person as anyone. You have the time. You have the patience, if the hours you have spent here are any indication. You have the love for the show that is the only necessary qualification for finding what is hidden in it. Go look! Springfield is not going anywhere. It never is. Number. Section 24. The deeper architecture of Springfield's sound. We spoke earlier about the audio secrets of The Simpsons, about the music buried in crowd noise, and the thematic underscore and the acoustic identity of specific locations. But there is a dimension of the show's sound design that deserves its own sustained attention, because it is the dimension that is furthest from any kind of documentation and closest to the experience of simply living in Springfield as a viewer. This dimension is the relationship between sound and silence. The Simpsons is a very loud show. It has always been a very loud show. The dialogue is dense, the comedic beats are fast, the music cues are frequent, the sound effects are expressive and often exaggerated. This is appropriate to the form. Animated television has always used sound expansively, has always been willing to fill sonic space in ways that live-action drama would consider excessive, because the visual world of animation requires audio support to feel inhabited, and because the comic timing of animated performance depends on precise, emphatic sound design. But within the show's general loudness, there are moments of specific, deliberate quiet that function as something quite different from the surrounding material. Moments in which the dense sonic texture of a typical scene pulls back, not to nothing, but to a carefully managed reduction that creates a specific quality of attention. Moments in which the ambient sound drops to a lower level, in which the musical underscore reduces or disappears, in which the dialogue pauses in a way that is not a comedic beat, but something else. Moments that feel, within the context of the show's normal sonic environment, like a held breath. These moments are the show's most vulnerable. They are the moments in which it stops performing briefly and simply is. They tend to occur at specific emotional junctures, at the moments when the show has said something that it wants the audience to actually receive, rather than to process and move past. The quiet is a container for the thing that just happened. It holds the moment open long enough for it to do its work. The most famous of these quiet moments is the ending of Homer's barbershop quartet from Season 5, in which Homer's description of his time with the B-sharps ends with a silence that contains everything the episode has said about youth and middle age and the things we give up in the process of becoming who we are. The silence is about 6 seconds long. In the context of a primetime animated comedy, 6 seconds of near silence is an extraordinary commitment. It is the show refusing to move on, insisting that what just happened deserves to be felt, rather than immediately followed by the next joke. But the famous examples are not the most interesting ones. The most interesting examples of deliberate silence in The Simpsons are the ones that are too brief to be consciously registered as silence. The pauses of 1 or 2 seconds that occur in the middle of scenes rather than at their ends. The moments when the ambient texture drops slightly and then returns, creating a barely perceptible fluctuation in the sonic density of the scene that the conscious mind does not register as silence, but that the body registers as something. These micro-silences cluster around specific types of moments. Around the moments when a character realizes something. Around the moments when the emotional content of a scene shifts from one register to another. Around the moments when something true is said in a context that surrounds it with comedy so that most of the audience will experience the comedy without noticing the truth. The micro-silence is a signal, not loud enough to be a signal that most viewers consciously receive, but present enough to create a small change in the experience of the scene, a tiny inflection of the emotional environment that contributes to the feeling that something has happened, even when the conscious mind cannot identify what. This is the most sophisticated form of sound design in the show, and it is the least documented because it operates below the threshold of conscious awareness and can only be found by someone who is listening for it specifically, with the kind of sustained and patient attention that most people do not bring to the audio track of a cartoon. But it is there, in episode after episode across the show's history, in the micro-pauses that the show uses to create meaning in the gaps between its jokes. There is also the sound of the Simpson house itself, which is distinct from the sound of any other location in the show, and which changes across seasons in ways that track the emotional tenor of the family's situation, in ways that most viewers have registered without registering them. The Simpson house in the early seasons has a specific acoustic quality that comes from the combination of ambient sounds that populate its interior. The refrigerator hum, the sound of the television in the living room, audible from the kitchen as an indistinct murmur, the settling sounds of a wooden house, the specific quality of outdoor sound that comes through the windows, appropriate to the season of the year implied by the episode. These sounds are always present, always combined in the same way, creating an acoustic environment that is as specific and as consistent as the visual environment. As the show progresses, as the family stories become more elaborate, and the emotional stakes of individual episodes become higher, the acoustic environment of the house changes in small ways. The ambient sounds become slightly more complex. The specific sounds that populated the early season's domestic interiors are joined by additional sounds, additional layers of environmental texture that make the house feel like a place that has accumulated history. Not just a domestic space, but a specific domestic space, with a specific family's specific acoustic history deposited in its walls. This is the sound of a family living in a house across time. The house accumulates them. Their sounds layer into its ambient texture, the way the sounds of any real household layer into the acoustic memory of the space. And the accumulated sound of the Simpson house, tracked across the show's long run, is a portrait of the family in the same way that the accumulated visible details of the house are a portrait of the family. A portrait that exists only in aggregate, visible only to someone who has listened long enough and carefully enough to hear what has been building. The sound of Springfield is the part of the show that is most completely invisible to anyone who is not listening for it, but it is the part of the show that has been most consistently working on every viewer for 36 years, creating atmosphere, shaping emotion, marking time, building the sense of a world that is real because it sounds real, in the specific and detailed way that real things sound. The sounds of Springfield are not decoration. They are the show's other half, the half that most people have never consciously heard. The half that has been doing its work in the dark, below the threshold of awareness, for as long as the show has been running. That half contains its own hidden content, its own Easter eggs, its own patient cargo of meaning waiting for the right listener. It has been waiting since the first episode aired. It will keep waiting, patiently, for as long as the show exists. Number. Section 25. The Springfield that never changed, and the one that did. There are two Springfields. The first one is the Springfield that everyone knows, the one that appears in every episode, that contains the same streets and the same buildings and the same people in the same relationships doing the same kinds of things, season after season, in the specific perpetual present of the floating timeline. This Springfield does not change in any fundamental way. Its population is fixed, its geography is consistent within each episode even if it varies between them. Its emotional dynamics are stable. The family is always together, Burns is always in charge, Moe's Tavern is always open. The school is always there for Bart and Lisa to return to. This is the Springfield that is visible, the one that the show presents as its world, the one that most viewers understand themselves to be watching. The second Springfield exists in the accumulated space between episodes, in the details that change slightly between one episode and the next, and then change back, in the background details that track the passage of time within storylines and then reset when the storyline ends, in the emotional residue of episodes that is visible in subsequent episodes as a trace, a memory, a slight alteration of the way characters relate to each other that persists for a few episodes before the general reset reasserts itself. This is the Springfield that changes. Not in the ways that the first Springfield cannot change, not in the ways that would violate the floating timeline or require the acknowledgement that time has actually passed and the characters have actually grown. It changes in smaller ways, in the ways that real places and real relationships change between significant events, in the texture of the everyday, which is never quite the same from one day to the next even when the structure of the days is identical. Finding the second Springfield requires the kind of attention that notices small things across a long time. It requires watching enough episodes closely enough and remembering them well enough to detect the small variations that accumulate and dissipate between episodes, the traces of the first Springfield's events that are visible in the second Springfield's details. This is the hardest kind of attention to sustain, because the show does not reward it explicitly, and the rewards that do come from it are the quietest and most private kind. The reward is simply noticing that things are slightly different, that the relationship between two characters in the background of a crowd scene is being carried differently than it was before a specific episode changed something between them, that the specific object is gone from the kitchen counter where it was before a specific event removed it, that the acoustic quality of a specific location is subtly altered in episodes that follow a specific change in what that location contains. These are not dramatic rewards. They are the rewards of attention itself, of the specific pleasure of noticing, of finding evidence that someone else was paying attention before you were, that someone embedded these small changes because they believed the world deserved that kind of consistency even in the parts that no viewer was expected to track. The two Springfields coexist in every episode. The one that is always the same and the one that is always slightly different. The one that the show wants you to see and the one that the show has quietly built for the people who are looking carefully enough to find it. Both are real, both are Springfield. And the space between them, the space that is neither the fixed world nor the changing one but the relationship between them, is where most of the show's deepest content lies. In the tension between permanence and change, between the story the show tells about a world that never ages and the evidence it quietly accumulates of a world that cannot stop accumulating time, Springfield is a place where nothing changes and everything changes, depending on how carefully you are looking. That paradox is not a failure of the show's logic. It is the show's deepest observation about the nature of home, about the way places we love seem permanent to us even as they change around us, about the way families seem fixed in our memory even as the people in them grow and alter and move through time, about the way the places we come back to seem always the same and never quite the same, and how both of those things are true simultaneously, not alternately. Springfield is always there, and it is never quite the same Springfield. And the attention required to notice the difference is the same attention required to love a place, or a family, or a show, which is the kind of attention that brings you back, again and again, to something you have seen before, because you are not sure you have fully seen it yet. You have not. Nobody has. That is the gift the show gives, and it keeps giving it, season after season, episode after episode, in the invisible parts of a world that was built to be inexhaustible. Number section 26. Everything the Simpsons kept. The Simpsons has been on the air long enough to have outlasted most of the things it originally parodied. The television formats it satirized in its early seasons no longer exist in the forms they took then. The political figures it lampooned in its middle seasons have, in most cases, left the stage. The cultural anxieties it mapped in its peak years have been replaced by different anxieties, though the underlying structures that produce those anxieties are recognizably the same structures, wearing different clothes. The show has outlasted its own references, and what it has done with that longevity is something no one planned and no one designed. But that constitutes one of the most extraordinary things any television show has ever accomplished. It has become a container, a repository of the specific texture of American life across 3.5 decades. Not a representation of that texture in the dramatic sense, not a faithful simulation. Something more like an archive. A place where specific moments, specific references, specific concerns, specific enthusiasms, Specific fears were deposited and kept even after the world outside moved on from them. When you watch a Simpsons episode from 1993, you are not watching a representation of 1993. You are inside a specific community's experience of 1993. Inside the specific jokes they told about that moment, the specific anxieties they felt about it, the specific enthusiasms that were alive in them then. The show is a time machine in a very specific and limited sense. It does not show you 1993. It shows you how it felt to be a specific group of intelligent, funny, worried, hopeful people making a television show in 1993. The hidden content of those episodes is not just Easter eggs for the attentive viewer. It is the texture of that experience, preserved in the background details and the audio choices and the thematic preoccupations that the show's explicit content does not always make visible. The signs on Springfield's buildings in 1993 reflect the commercial anxieties of that moment. The guest star choices reflect the cultural preoccupations. The specific background crowds reflect the specific look of American public life in that period. The show kept all of it, in the backgrounds and margins and edges of frames, without knowing that it was keeping it, without intending to preserve anything beyond the episode itself. But it did preserve it. 36 years later, the evidence of those moments is still there. In every episode, in every frame, in every sound, waiting for a viewer who knows enough to recognize what they are looking at. Waiting for someone who can say, yes, this is what it looked like, this is what people were worried about, this is what a specific community of intelligent, funny people in America thought was worth making jokes about in that specific year. The show kept the world it was made in. It kept it without meaning to. It kept it because the people who made it believed in making it completely, all the way through, in every detail. Even the details that had no purpose beyond making the world feel real in the moment it was created. And the world they kept is there, in the invisible parts of the show, available to any viewer patient enough and knowledgeable enough to find it. All of it. All 36 years. All 788 episodes. All the moments that were supposed to be background filler and turned out to be something more. The Simpsons kept everything. It keeps it still. That is the nature of something made with this much care, by this many people, across this much time. The care accumulated, the people accumulated, the time accumulated. And what they made is a world that is inexhaustible, not because it was built to be infinite, but because it was built, every part of it, with the specific kind of attention that produces inexhaustibility as a consequence. Every episode is a door. Every frame is a room. Every background detail is an object in the room that might be ordinary decoration or might be something that someone placed there for you to find. Most of them are still waiting. Springfield always is. Number. Section 27. The patience of the people who made it. There is a word that keeps appearing when you think seriously about the hidden content of The Simpsons. The word is patience. The patience of the animator who drew a background crowd at a theme park and took the time to put one figure facing a wall, knowing the figure would be on screen for 2 seconds and that almost no viewer would ever see it. The patience of the writer who put a Borges reference on a bookshop sign in the background of a crowd scene in a primetime animated comedy, knowing the reference would be legible only to a fraction of the audience. The patience of the sound designer who buried a real conversation inside ambient crowd noise, knowing that extracting it would require equipment and effort that no ordinary viewer would apply. The patience of the astronomer, or the writer who thought like one, who put the stars in the right positions above a fictional city that does not exist on any map. The patience of the people who made this show is the show's most underappreciated quality. It is more impressive, in some ways, than the wit or the intelligence or the cultural depth, because it is rarer. Wit is common among talented people. Intelligence is common among talented people. But the patience to do invisible work, to put genuine care into the parts of a thing that no one is going to see, to believe that even the invisible parts of a world deserve to be built completely, that is not common. That is something else. It is the quality that distinguishes a craftsperson from a competent producer. The craftsperson makes the thing right all the way through. The competent producer makes it work well enough. Both can produce something good. Only the craftsperson produces something inexhaustible, because only the craftsperson has put enough into the invisible parts that there is always something left to find. The Simpsons was made by craftspeople. by people who cared about what they were making at a level that went well beyond what the job required, that extended into parts of the production that no one was asking them to care about, that persisted across seasons and years and the various changes in the show's circumstances and creative culture. By people who maintained that care even when the show was changing, even when its quality was varying, even when the cultural context that had made the show's specific kind of care legible and valued was shifting in ways that made it harder to sustain. The hidden content is the evidence of that care. Every background detail that rewards attention is evidence that someone chose to attend to it. Every piece of accurate science or precise music or correct night sky is evidence that someone chose accuracy over convenience. Every private reference and personal acknowledgement and embedded tribute is evidence that someone chose to make the world complete rather than merely functional. The people who made The Simpsons were not perfect. The show is not perfect. It has failed and recovered and failed again across its long run. And the hidden content is not equally distributed across all of its seasons. The care is concentrated in specific periods, produced by specific communities of people who shared specific values about what the work deserved. The care is most visible in the seasons that everyone agrees are the best seasons, which is not a coincidence. The care is what made them the best seasons. Not just the visible care, the brilliant writing and the precise animation and the memorable performances, but the invisible care. The background signs and the buried conversations and the correct stars and all the other evidence that the people making the show believed in it completely. Believing in something completely is the rarest and most necessary quality in creative work. It is the quality that determines whether a thing will last, whether it will continue to reward attention across years and decades, whether it will give back more than any individual viewer can take from it. The Simpsons has lasted because the people who made it at its best believed in it at that level. Believed in Springfield as a place that deserved to be real, in its characters as people who deserved to be consistent, in its world as a world that deserved to be complete. The patience required to act on that belief, across seasons of television production, in the invisible parts of frames that flash by in seconds, is the show's deepest achievement. More than any individual episode or character or joke, the patience is what made everything else possible. It is what makes the hidden content possible. The patience of putting something there that no one is supposed to see, because the world deserves to be complete even in its invisible parts. Because making a world means making all of it. Because craftsmanship is not a strategy, it is a way of being in relation to the work, and that way of being leaves its marks everywhere, including in all the places where no one was looking. The patience of the people who made The Simpsons is the reason we are here, why there is something to find in the invisible parts of this show. Why the search for hidden content in a cartoon that has been on the air for 36 years is a genuine and rewarding activity rather than an exercise in wishful thinking. Why every layer you investigate reveals another layer beneath it, and another beneath that, extending down into the production in ways that no one person put there deliberately but that are there nonetheless, because this is what happens when enough people who care enough spend enough time making something they believe in. What they left behind is what you find when you look, and what you find is the evidence of their belief. Of all those hours of patient, invisible, unrewarded care. Of all those decisions made in the backgrounds of frames that no one was supposed to examine. Of all those moments when someone could have cut a corner and chose not to, because the world deserved better than a cut corner, even in the part of the world that no one would ever see. That is The Simpsons. That is Springfield. That is the city that has been waiting for you to find what was left in it, and that will keep waiting for the next person and the one after that, for as long as the show exists and the patience of the people who made it remains embedded in its invisible parts. It has been there all along. It will always be there. You just have to be patient enough to look. The show will be here when you come back. It always is. Not because it is running on a server somewhere, though it is. Not because the files are stored and the streams are live, though they are. The show will be here because Springfield is the kind of place that stays. That persists not just as data, but as somewhere real in the imagination of everyone who has spent time there. A city that exists in the accumulated experience of its audience more completely than many real cities exist in the experience of people who have actually walked their streets. You have spent time there tonight, more time than most. You have walked streets that go deeper than the ones most viewers ever reach, into the parts of the city that were built for patience rather than for speed, for attention rather than for entertainment alone. You have found things there. Things that were left for you by people who made them with no certainty that anyone would ever look. They looked anyway. They put the things there anyway. They believed in the world they were making at a level that made the invisible parts as real as the visible ones. And that belief is what you have been walking through tonight. The texture of that belief, deposited in the backgrounds and audio tracks and production choices of 788 episodes across 36 years, the city they built is inexhaustible. You could come back tomorrow and find something new. You could come back for 36 more years and still be finding things. That is not a figure of speech. That is the literal truth of what this show contains. More than any viewer has found, more than any viewer ever will find, an endless depth of invisible care, waiting in the places no one is supposed to look. Come back when you can. The invisible city will be there. One more thing before you sleep. The people who made The Simpsons did not know they were making something that would last 36 years. They could not have known. No one can know that about the thing they are making while they are making it. They knew they were making a good show. They knew they were working with talented people on material that was worth taking seriously. They knew they believed in the world they were building and that their belief was showing up in the work, in the visible parts and the invisible parts both. What they could not know was that their belief would persist in the work for decades after the specific moments of its creation had passed. That the care they put into the background of a crowd scene in 1993 would still be there in 2026, available to a viewer who happened to pause at the right frame and look at the right corner of the image. That the specific enthusiasm of a specific writer for a specific author or mathematician or tradition of music or period of film history would be preserved in a background sign or an underscore Q or a structural choice, legible to anyone who happened to share that enthusiasm and to be watching carefully enough to recognize it. The hidden content of The Simpsons is the ghost of specific moments of human attention, of specific people in specific places at specific times, caring about specific things and putting that care into the work they were making. The ghost is still there, in every frame, in every ambient sound, in every choice of every kind that went into making this show what it is. It is there because care does not disappear from the things it is put into. It accumulates, it persists, it waits. You have been in its presence tonight. There is something worth holding on to in that. In the knowledge that someone, somewhere, at some point during the production of the episode you are watching, cared enough to do something invisible and right, to put the stars in the correct positions, to put the real conversation in the crowd noise, to put the right book on the right shelf in the right kind of home, to make the world complete in the part of the world that no one was supposed to see. They did it for the work. They did it because the work deserved it, and the work kept it. The way work always keeps what is put into it with sufficient care, and held it available for anyone patient enough to find it. You are patient enough. You have been here long enough to prove it. Take what you found tonight and carry it with you. Back to Springfield, when you return. Back to the episodes you have already seen, which now contain something you did not know was there before. Back to the ones you have not yet watched, which contain things you cannot yet imagine finding. The city is inexhaustible. The patience was real. The care is still there. The invisible city will be there when you come back. It has been there all along. In every corner of every frame, in every background detail, in every choice that someone made in the quiet hours of production, doing invisible work for a world they believed in completely. That belief is what you found tonight, hidden inside a cartoon. Hidden inside a world that looks simple from the outside and turns out to be bottomless when you look carefully enough. Bottomless and patient and still. It is always still in Springfield, in the parts no one was supposed to see, in the background of the crowd scene, in the sky above the fictional city, in the ambient sound beneath the dialogue, in the tear in Homer's chair that grew, slowly, across a season and a half, because someone believed even a chair deserved to be treated as though it were real. All of it is still there, still patient, still waiting. Take your time. There is no hurry. Springfield will not run out of things to show you. It never has. Springfield is 36 years old, and it is still being built. Every viewer who looks carefully adds something to it. Every question that gets asked and answered extends the map of a city that has no edges. The people who made it put the foundation in. The people who watch it carefully enough fill in what was left between the visible stones. You are part of Springfield now. You have been for as long as you have been watching. You were part of it before tonight, and tonight you went deeper than most people go, and Springfield went deeper with you. That is what it does. That is all it has ever done. Deeper and deeper and never quite to the bottom. Good night.